The music room at Honoria Talgarth's Belgrave Square house had the well-bred glow of a salon that believed itself a little more modest than it was. Evening light, dying flatteringly, lay upon gilt frames, upon a small portrait by a name that could be spoken with the amiable humility of pretended indifference, and upon a black Steinway whose lid reflected, like a dark pool, the chandelier's mild coruscations. The domestic commas were in place. A silver coffee tray, a bowl of white roses exact as a phrase, a faint scent of beeswax and good leather. Only the score on the piano, banded with string, resisted the general sense of conclusion. It made a small promise of trouble. Lady Honoria's charity committees, her trusteeships, and her matutinal letters to the Times were considered by her friends with a polite alarm that had found ritual expression over 40 years. She was tall, hawk-faced under a wrap of dove-grey chiffon, and wore pearls so even that one suspected a conspiracy. She stood near the piano, conversing with the composer, Julian Mercator, who held himself like a blade, and with Lionel Quinton, an impresario, whose compact elegance did not entirely conceal an anxious dampness at the temples. A handful of guests had been siphoned in to make, as Honoria put it, an audience of sympathetic intelligence for a trial of Mr. Mercator's Overture to Treachery, to be performed at her gala for the Lyrics Rebuilding Fund next week. "You will hear what I have heard," she had told Inspector Roderick Alleyn, greeting him as if she had herself formed him at a better school and remained, from long practice, pleased with the result. A young man, he is, 30, and already with the confidence of a terrible age. "Roderick, may I call you that? You observe he has named his piece with an unseemly frankness. One recoils, and yet one listens. You are not to take it as a personal admonition." "On the contrary, Lady Honoria," Alleyn had said, "it will be an instructive preparation for a policeman." He stood now with his wife Troy, half a step back from the piano. She had been trapped by Honoria into designing the program cover. A line, my dear, no more than a line, because the audience is illiterate, and watched with the tolerant concentration of a painter considering someone else's work. Her profile had its own spare music. They were together in the right place. He as a guest tolerated as an amusing departure from the purely decorative. She as an artist elevated to a kind of domestic deity in that particular room. The guests revealed themselves in points and commas. Sir Fulk Armitage, retired from a life of organizing men and now engaged in organizing recreations, sat bolt upright in a bergère, his hands on his knees, his moustache like a small decision made in youth and never revised. Clarissa Dane, Honoria's niece, slender and incandescent in the manner of girls who know their entrance has been arranged for them, toyed with a violin case and looked at nothing with extraordinary intentness. A critic, Peter Ashe, had found the only chair that permitted him to appear indolent and vigilant at once. Dr. Pargeter, sound of waistcoat, had planted himself near the drinks with the air of a man who could diagnose a rumor as if it were a rash. The house's butler, Mr. Bracknell, moved with clerical gravity. One felt if he were to intone the grace, he would do it in 6/8 time to suit the occasion. Mercator, called to the keyboard, did not sit so much as fold himself down. He was pale in the difficult way of those who have had no time to be anything else. His hair was too long, his collar curious. When he put his hands to the keys, one saw, under the validity of his confidence, a small tremor that might be ardor or might be rage. "One begs you, Lionel." "No chatter during the unisons," Honoria murmured. "There is a passage of wind in both senses, which grows upon the listener." "Bless us," Quinton said, and achieved an almost miraculous silence. The overture began, not with a shout, but with a kind of clearing of the throat. A low figure in the left hand, an errant oboe insinuating itself from the other end of the room in imagination, the suggestion of strings like a whisper shifting its weight on polished floors. Clarissa, who had slipped the violin from its case, shadowed a phrase without sound. One could see it in her wrist. She kept her eyes, however, not on the music, but on Mercator, as if he were a peril one might study into safety. Alleyn heard the decent murmur of a well-managed house behind the music. A door moving somewhere into a soft latch, glasses chiming faintly, footsteps calculating themselves not to exist. The over-voice of society, what was said and what was thought, threaded the bars. He watched Mercator, who played with the folded economy of a man correcting constantly an inexorable first draft. At the last page he hesitated, not theatrically, but as if he had seen at the bottom of a letter something written in another hand. Then he ended cleanly and took his hands away as if they had nothing to do with him. There was the decent degree of appreciation. Sir Fulk said "bravo," as if it were a rank bestowed. Peter Ashe contributed a monosyllable that hovered between thought and bile. Quinton applauded with an air of personal relief, and Honoria, too moved to be tactful, said, "It will do admirably," in a tone that suggested she had just accepted a battle plan. "Treachery?" Dr. Pargeter inquired, hunting for a delicate way to be disapproving and interesting in the same sentence. "It is a musical term in this instance," Mercator said without smiling. "It indicates the entrance of truth when one has committed to a lie." "How extremely unfashionable," Peter Ashe murmured. Clarissa had joined Mercator by the piano and was aligning the pages with careful, unmusicianly hands. "Julian," she said under her breath, as if speaking to a person who could vanish, "you must alter the phrasings in the second subject. It will not carry. It simply will not." "It will if you play it as written," he said, soft and clean as his cadences. Quinton drifted in with a glass, rattling ice, and made a small fuss over coasters. "We do feel, my dear fellow, that your title is perhaps, well, merely from a box-office point of view, you understand." "Leave it," Honoria said, stopping him with one hand, as she might have stopped a child from handling the Worcester. "If the young insist on naming their devils, we must indulge them. I'm too old to pretend the world is unpeopled by unpleasant facts. And now, Roderick, what is your professional opinion of sin in E-flat?" "That it's better confessed than paraded," Alleyn said. "Quite," she returned, taking from him the line and making it socially acceptable. "Mr. Bracknell, coffee, please. Dr. Pargeter, do allow me. Clarissa, no, you will have honey and lemon. You see, Roderick, the young will exhaust themselves without guidance." The butler brought the coffee tray. The cups were of an age, and the tray's engraving had been polished thin. Alleyn watched, without watching, as the cups found their proper owners, as brandy nested near Sir Fulk, and tea near Honoria. Mr. Bracknell did not ask. He placed. That was the mark of a house that had rehearsed itself. Only one small improvisation occurred. Clarissa, who should have received her lemon and honey to the left of the piano, moved before he reached it, and the little glass was set down where she might not see it. Troy observed the displacement as a painter notices a light turned a degree too far. She said nothing. "Roderick," Honoria said, "I have such a fondness for your wife when she is looking replete with contempt. It is the only expression that gives me hope for our day. Lionel, you will not tell me you have mislaid a singer. The contralto, the famous person, where is she?" Quinton's dampness became, for a fraction, a separate creature. "Dame Imogen is delayed." "She is always delayed," said Sir Fulk, who approved of punctuality chiefly for the fear it spread. "In my time—" "In your time," Honoria intervened. "One did not have to make a public out of a population that hadn't asked to be entertained. Imogen will arrive when the attention is most available. Do sit, child," she added to Clarissa, who had remained, oddly, with her case unopened and her bow arm tense as a thing on a mantle. Clarissa sat obediently by the roses. Their scent made a small argument with the room's beeswax. She looked again at Mercator and then away. If one had been the sort of policeman who preferred behavior to evidence, one could have drawn a conceit that the overture's title had lodged somewhere behind the girl's eyes. Alleyn felt the thin vibration of it. He could not have said for what purpose he catalogued these things. He could only admit, privately and without vanity, that he collected them as one might collect pressed leaves, particulars whose shape would eventually be instructive. Dame Imogen Verrall arrived at last in an arrangement of silk and apology. She had one of those faces that were formed to reassure the cruel, the mouth soft, the forehead smooth, the glance that refused to betray grievances because it had understood the world to be a general grievance. She kissed Honoria's with an operatic economy, took Quentin's hand in both of hers, and bestowed on Mercator a cool nod that could be made into anything if one wished. "Darling," she said to Clarissa, "you have grown yet lovelier, which is inconsiderate." Then to Honoria, "You are divine." And to Alleyn, "Forgive me, but one never forgets a policeman. One hopes to, no, that will not do. You must teach me tact, Inspector. It's out of tune." "If it is," Alleyn said, "I have been allowed to play it very seldom." Dame Imogen laughed as if given a cue and accepted honey and lemon. She sipped, grimaced, and looked at the glass as if it had confounded her. "Too much of the bee and not enough of the lemon," she said. "Or is it the other way about? Bracknell, dear man, have you stolen my voice?" "I trust not, madam," Mr. Bracknell said, and a fractional pause followed before he added, "Madam." The little postponement, like a missed beat, left itself in the air. Troy heard it. Alleyn looked at Bracknell in profile and thought, he's tired, or he is something like tired. In such houses one forgot that servants aged under discipline as trees under wind. "Let us make the trial," Honoria said, restoring a line to the scene. "Imogen, you will consider the second subject, which Clarissa finds unsupportable with your sensibility. Lionel, if you titter, I shall send you away. Mr. Mercator, will you condescend to the accompaniment? Sir Fulk, you may glower at us if it will strengthen your blood." They made themselves ready with the manner of people who had played at concert-giving since childhood. Alleyn moved a hair's breadth so that he might watch without appearing to watch. He found again, as always at the edges of art in rooms such as this, a curious ache which had nothing to do with murder or mania, the ache of being present at something that was both excessively trivial and perilously exact. Dame Imogen placed herself by the piano, set her shoulders as if to lift her own voice, and sang. She sang very beautifully and a little too beautifully, as people do who have found that effort can be concealed under texture. The second subject was perhaps, even to Alleyn's ear, a treachery in itself. A long, argumentative line that asked to be sung as a confession and objected when it was made into a speech. Clarissa's breath caught once like a muffled sob. Mercator played intractably. Honoria watched them with the calm of a general making his dispositions. When it ended, Dame Imogen assented to the applause with a queenliness that lacked malice. "It will do," she said, echoing Honoria. "If only one could sing the thing without telling the truth." "Then you will not," Peter Ashe said softly. She did not look at him. "Then I will try." The domestic commas reasserted themselves. Coffee cooled. The roses subsided as roses do, with grace and a suggestion of scandal. Sir Fulk spoke to Dr. Pargeter of an insurance scheme that involved music only in the manner of a necessary evil. Quentin, abolished of immediate responsibilities, began to be gregariously foolish with Troy and was tamped down by a look he half took for encouragement. Clarissa slipped away with her case to the far end of the room and looked out onto Belgrave Square. Alleyn drifted, amiable, in their eddies. "Tell me," Honoria said in his ear, "as a man whose business is the detection of that which does not wish to be detected, is Julian mercurial or merely modern?" "He's both, I expect," Alleyn said, "and obedient to them." "Obedient?" She looked pleased. "Roderick, you are comforting. I had feared he was sovereign." "Not yet," Alleyn said. Honoria nodded, as if this had been her opinion and she had arranged for him to say it. "We shall save them from themselves, then. Mr. Bracknell, your people may bring the sandwiches. I refuse to be responsible for art on an empty stomach." Mr. Bracknell bowed and went, taking with him some portion of the room's equilibrium that only he had held. Alleyn watched him go, and thought that even in rooms that had rehearsed themselves to seem a fortress, there were always the tiny occasions of dissonance. The rearranged glass, the postponed "Madam," the tremor in a composer's hand. The attention given to a title as if it were a diagnosis. It was ridiculous, of course, to make a start, to trace on the room's clear surface any premonitory sign. But his trade was to notice and not to be ridiculous. "Roderick," Troy said beside him, very low. "The little glass for the lemon. Clarissa didn't have it. Imogen did, and Imogen didn't like it." "She didn't moderate her dislike either," Alleyn said. "No, she let it be ordinary." He nodded. "The sin in E-flat." "You are horrible. Only professionally." She smiled and moved away, her dress making the small noise of good silk. Alleyn thought that if one were to draw an overture to Treachery, one might begin with small instruments, a glass out of place, a phrase missung on purpose, a servant's pause. One would wait for the brass with resignation. He put down his cup, which had gone cold out of politeness, and attended to Honoria's sandwiches, which were always remarkably sound. Outside, the square softened into evening. The lamps came on, and one saw one's reflection faintly imposed on the window panes. People civil and softened by wealth, arranged like notes on a stave. It was a decent picture. There was even a suggestion of peace. Alleyn, who had learned to distrust peace when it announced itself in such rooms, marked it and waited. When the last chord of the Davenant Overture lay folded upon the air like a silk scarf after a measured dance, the room remembered itself. Applause came. Not the vulgar spatter that bruises music, but a careful, almost grateful patter. Then voices, then a weightless dispersal towards the promise of supper, warmth, and talk that would be about anything but the thing itself. Lady Leonora's drawing-room, contrived for the display of both canvas and character, shed its concert air and re-inhabited its former social self. Footmen breathed again. The great silver lilies in the stand by the piano ceased to watch so sternly. It was not yet 11. At the far end of the long room, the French windows showed black rectangles, more mirror than view. In their glass, the assembled seemed to float, bright as moths, about the fixed points of the pianoforte and the tall white column where a bronze of Terpsichore raised her hand to the ceiling's plaster rosettes. Sir Julian, with his compact figure and pale, well-shaped head, had bowed once and not prodigally. He had a peculiar way of acknowledging, as if he accepted praise not for himself, but on behalf of an exacting friend who was, for the most part, displeased. His baton, a slim ivory thing with a tiny obsidian cap, lay across the scored pages like a trout across reeds. Felix Davenant, the composer, sat to one side of the keyboard in his narrow suit, looking down at his fingers as if he had not expected them to manage so well. Camilla Ashenden, the voice of the piece, stood quiet with color like faint rose marble in her face, every inch the carefully curated debutante who also sang, and very nearly with distinction. "Brave of you to tackle the high line," murmured Mrs. Vale behind her folded fan. "He writes for a throat like a rapier." She had the looks of a woman for whom rapier blue satin is an old friend, and spoke, for all her kindness, as one to whom applause had once come without requesting permission. "A charming introduction to the season," said Peregrine Bligh, drawing his thin eyebrows to agreeable surprise. "One forgets that genuine experiment may be polite." "Polite experiment is none at all," said the general, but not with rancor. He looked content, as men do when their wives have arranged an evening which has required nothing execrable from them. "Lady Leonora," with her pearls and her knack of disposing a room as one disposes flowers, signaled the drift towards food. "Pym," she said, and the butler, who had observed the company as one observes a sequence of recreations in a work by a master one does not altogether admire, opened the doors. The party altered its shape, took on the line of a procession that made a little chatter as it went. Sir Julian had not moved. He was listening to something, or rather trying to hear it again. Davenant spoke to him in a low voice. The conductor lifted his chin 1/8 of an inch. The gesture meant, "We shall speak in 5 minutes, when it matters." He disliked to be crowded immediately after performance. There were rituals about such things, the observance of which he held a kind of religious courtesy. One saw these in him as much as in the way he walked, with an economy that made him seem taller than he was. "Barley water, Pym," he said as the first portion of the company flowed through. "The decanter, please, and the glass with the—" "Yes." "The small lemon slice," said Pym. "Certainly, Sir Julian." He might have said, "as on Thursday," or "as always." In the manner of that household, the repetition needed no words worn underfoot with use. Pym withdrew across the carpet like a thought remembered and sent away again. Camilla, who had been intercepted by a cousin, unhooked the pale ribbon of her program and secured it about the lilies in the way of girls who wished the room to know they were here and were noticed. Davenant had the look of a man at the end of his tether and acutely mindful that it had held. He plucked the corners of his score and frowned at a torn page edge. "You didn't feel it rush?" he asked, no one in particular. It was controlled. Sir Julian's voice from the music stand. There was no warmth and no cold. It was exactly the temperature of professional behavior. "We can talk after. I shall come down." "Don't be too long," Lady Leonora said, pausing. "I have an elderly bishop who must be made to feel he heard what he did." Sir Julian smiled in the way artists do when society has been kindly. 2 minutes. He had already rolled the corners of a handkerchief back upon a small silver cylinder which housed his lozenges. He was fussy about his throat. The handkerchief had the faintest breath of cologne. His wife, long gone to plot the end of her own season in the south of France, had given him the cylinder. Inside, the pellets were pale and square as sugar, with a chalky bloom. Pym returned with the tray. It bore a decanter squared like a gentleman's shoulders, the water inside clouded with lemon, and the glass he favoured. A light, old-fashioned tumbler with the crest sanded on it so faintly it could be mistaken for a floor. "Thank you," Sir Julian said. "Leave it on the old table." The old table had come from Lady Leonora's grandmother and had a narrow crack along one leaf which took the light like a hairline. Pym placed the tray there, with the 2 coasters set as they were always set, the one with the minute chip to the left, as Sir Julian liked. In the movement he captured the smell of something that did not belong to Sir Julian, a powder perhaps, faint and cool. He did not look up. He saw at the edge of his attention Camilla's pale scarf slip from the back of the music stool and come to rest under the pedal like a little mist. "Is there to be supper?" said Mr. Bligh, somewhere behind, to no one and everyone. And there was. One heard the proof of it in the change of voices in the hall. Most had gone down. Felix had gone last, turning back once as if to make sure the score would not rise and follow him like a reproach. The music room altered. Without people, it became very still, more so than an empty room usually is. The ticking of a metronome, nobody had wound it, asserted itself and then faded, recognizing a rival in the long, small sound the gas made in the sconces. Sir Julian stood with his back to the windows, the glass and the handkerchief on the table, the baton parallel to the stave. He took the handkerchief, unfolded it from the little cylinder, and touched the silver with a finger. He had a short palate, and in cold weather he was plagued. He took one pellet, then after a second's thought another, and then, because the throat is ruled by the mind as much as the body, and his mind was not yet through with the evening, a third. He lifted the glass and drank the barley water slowly. A flake of lemon slid under his lip and out again. He smiled at nothing. After this, there is nothing dramatic to tell. He touched the top of the music with his fingers and closed it carefully, aligning paper against paper as if tucking it into bed. He sat in the conductor's chair, lifted the baton once and set it down. Eyes half shut, he became the image of a man who has listened to himself and has decided not to speak. The little muscle at the angle of his jaw lifted once and stopped. He rested his head back against the chair and found the unkind angle of it. The fault line along the old table took the light and lost it. The metronome, after all, had been wound. It ticked twice, a third time, and then chose to be silent. Sir Julian's right hand fell from the arm of the chair. It came to rest lightly on the reeded edge. There were no other movements. It was Miss Grey who came back first. Lady Grey, Lady Leonora's secretary, a slight woman with a brown, attentive face and a way of walking that took up no space. She had paused halfway to the dining room to recall a letter that ought to have been placed for the post last evening and had not. It was in the music stool or behind the pianoforte, she thought, where the world's other small omissions were stacked with care. She entered, and seeing Sir Julian, stopped as one stops not to interrupt a thought. Then, because she was used to men who fell into a certain vacancy after exertion, she moved softer than usual past him towards the stool, drew it with care, and knelt. The scarf kissed her hand. She put it up, folded it twice by habit, and set it on the piano. She found the little pile of overlooked items, pencil, clipped note, program marked with neat blue ticks, and the letter addressed to H.R. Ashenden Esquibans in Lady Leonora's hand. The room breathed its quiet air. Miss Grey thought of the bishop and the soup and whether Lady Leonora had noticed the slight looseness in the left heel of her new satin, and then she saw the glass. Not the first glass. Glasses are anonymous until they are not. This one had been lifted, drunk from, and set down with the exactness of a man for whom such things had muscle memory. There was a fine circle of froth where the lemon had kissed. There was, just inside the rim, a grain, 2 grains, the smallest remnants of something that would have passed unnoticed by anyone who had not once, as a child, spent a summer counting sugar through a kitchen sieve to please an old aunt who had lost her sight. Miss Grey did not move closer. She looked for Pym. She did not call. That would be wrong. She walked to the door and, taking nothing in her hands, returned to the hall and found Pym with the tranquility of a man in his own passage. "Mr. Pym," she said very quietly. Pym came as butlers do, without the appearance of haste either to the object or away from witnesses. He looked from Miss Grey to Sir Julian to the glass. Then he set the tray straight, which had not been crooked, and went near the chair without standing over it. He did not touch. He made the smallest sound in his throat as if to clear it, and then looked at Miss Grey. "I believe," he said, and the phrase was like a door in a calm room, "we had best inform her ladyship." Downstairs the bishop was telling Lady Leonora that modern music imitated the psalms in being a little harsh for the ears, but perhaps good for the soul, and Lady Leonora, very kind in her preoccupation, was saying that the soup would be perfectly simple and that simplicity was what everybody craved, when Pym appeared by a side door and took the angle of the room with sufficient discretion to be unnoticed by all, and after that with sufficient presence to be seen by his mistress only. She came at once. If any of the company noticed her absence, they did not betray it. Mrs. Vale lifted her glass and said once to young Ashenden, "You must be very proud of your child," which allowed Mrs. Ashenden time to become both proud and alarmed, as she always did when Imogen Vale was kind to her. In the music room, Lady Leonora stood still for a space and then went forward. She did not touch. "Sir Julian," she said, almost as a private courtesy. Pym, as if to anchor the moment, drew the curtains a little and left the French windows showing their black mirror. The gaslight was not unkind. It made Sir Julian's skin look smoother than it was. Miss Grey spoke in that curious, calm voice which belongs in offices and sick rooms. "Shall I telephone, my lady?" "Yes," Lady Leonora said. "And, if you please, not the local. Ask for Scotland Yard, Inspector Alleyn." She was very white, and then not so. "He is an old friend." Pym, who had a memory like a silver drawer for names and lines and the times at which curtains are to be drawn, did not raise an eyebrow. "At once, my lady." Miss Grey went out rapidly, almost unheard on the carpet. Lady Leonora and Pym stayed. Pym stood at just the distance that is respectful, and no more. Lady Leonora's eyes moved once to the little silver cylinder, and back to Sir Julian's hand on the chair. Everything in the room suggested that nothing had occurred but rest. The lilies exhaled their strong, indifferent scent. Somewhere downstairs, Peregrine Bligh told a story about a Russian ballerina who had wept real tears upon real sable, and the general laughed in a way that was good for him. Up here a minute became 2. The metronome, of its own accord, ticked once and was ashamed. "That will be all for the present, Pym," said Lady Leonora, calm because she must be. "We shall wait." And like a house that knows how to wait, the room enclosed them and made nothing of what had happened, except that it had happened quietly. Inspector Rowan Ashford arrived with the discretion of a late guest whose invitation had been mislaid in the post. There was no ostentation in his entry. A narrow man in a well-cut dark suit, the sort that taught a seam to keep its counsel, his hat held by the brim rather than the crown, as if anxieties were not to be pressed. He followed the butler along a short corridor upholstered with silence, compounded by good carpets and better breeding. "Her ladyship is in the small salon, sir," murmured the butler. "The doctor remains with Mr. Fielding." There was an almost imperceptible pause before the name, the kind that insinuates itself only after death has pinned it to a person like a ribbon. Ashford gave a quiet acknowledgement and allowed his glance to drift. He did not stop. He seldom did. He simply allowed things to meet him. The corridor offered its facts without insistence: an evening coat upon a stand, faintly perfumed with tobacco, a gilt console with a single lily stem abandoned in a silver ewer. Abandoned because a slow droplet from the stem had marked the wood with the faintest comet of water that no house of this sort would tolerate. The lamps were shaded, shadows frayed at their edges, forgiving detail without erasing it. If rumor were a physical object, it would have been contained under a bell jar this evening. The house did not permit it the air it required. The small salon opened with a restrained chime of glasses. Lady Otterline Vale, spare and silver as her sideboard, stood very straight beside a mahogany table. She was a woman the color of moonlight, whose hair had the engineered looseness of a certain generation. Her pearls, obedient as children, lay across a collarbone that had had opinions in its day. "Inspector." She did not say welcome. She offered instead the steadier platform. "This is odious. You will tell me what to do." "Thank you, Lady Otterline," said Ashford, with the suggestion of a bow one offers a fragile object. "There's very little to be done at this moment. Dr. Sandilands is with Mr. Fielding." "In the ante-room off the music room," she said. "I cannot—" The pearls shifted, a breath upon a strand. "He came in here from the rehearsal to be still for a moment. Poor Adrian always sat in the small room with his music when there were too many voices." There were sufficient voices now, all of them on their best behavior, which is to say, their worst. They grouped themselves with the precision of a well-fixed tableau. Victor Lanyard, the director, stood with an elbow upon the mantelpiece, studying the clock as if it were one of his actors. He had the complexion of a man who had read his own notices and not quite forgiven them. Rosamund Ashe, the soprano, sat upon the edge of an armchair, her gloves still on, as if she were not sure whether she would be expected to sing again. Beatrice Mortlake of the Evening Clarion had her pencil, but not her notebook. She held it like a cicada holds a blade of grass. Sir Peregrine Collingwood, whose moustache tried to do more work than his face, stood by the window, telling it something in undertones. Julian Hart, the painter, had a smear of silver on his cuff. He had folded his arms to hide it, and thereby displayed it. Arthur Pym, the butler, hovered at precisely the height of usefulness. He had the wary benevolence of a man who keeps a house not only with his hands, but with his mind. And there was Miss Dorothea Crane, Lady Otterline's secretary, small in stature but not in purpose, counting guests and glasses without needing to look. "Will you see the room?" asked Lady Otterline, as if the room were a person whose opinion she respected. Ashford assented. The music room was arranged for admiration rather than sound. The good instrument. Was it a harpsichord? No, a modern pianoforte disguised as an old friend occupied a corner in which drapery softened the angles. The anteroom beyond received the overflow, a small square space scarcely wider than its armchair, with a table that believed in itself, a lamp that did not. Mr. Fielding sat as if the day had closed his lids and found no further use for his hands. Dr. Sandilands, lean and not young, had covered those hands with a handkerchief after the practical rituals. Stethoscope, pulse, unavailing murmurs. The physician's eyes were clear on Ashford's. "It is done," he said softly. "He has been dead some minutes." "Peacefully?" "As far as such things are," Sandilands replied. There was more, but it belonged to later. The old discipline came to rest upon them. Ashford leaned as one leans to read a dedication. He did not touch the body. He made a small map in his head. The armchair's angle, the sheen upon the side table where a glass had been, the ghost of a damp ring upon the polished surface, a program leaf with a folded corner. The metronome on the mantel, motionless but set to a narrow tempo. The window, latched but a hair imperfect, enough to draw a thread of night air into the room. "Who found him?" Ashford asked gently. "Miss Crane," said Sandilands. "Her ladyship sent her to see if Mr. Fielding was ready for the toast." Ashford turned the question upon Miss Crane, who had materialized in the doorway with the soundless promptness of a stagehand. "He felt unwell?" Ashford asked. "He said nothing, Inspector," she said. Her voice was trained to deliver particulars. "I knocked, and when he did not answer, I opened the door a little. He was like this. I put down the glass I was carrying and ran for Dr. Sandilands." "What glass?" asked Ashford without weight. "The sherry," she said. "We had all had a glass before we began. Her ladyship said Mr. Fielding ought to have his before the toast, as he did not care to drink in company when he was rehearsing." Ashford looked at the faint ring upon the table. He thought about the manners of sherry. "And the glass you brought him?" Miss Crane's hands folded, unfolded. "I believe I set it on the music room sideboard in my hurry. I'm sorry." "Quite right to hurry," said Ashford. "Has anyone moved anything in this room since?" "No," said Dr. Sandilands. "I made that point quickly." Ashford allowed his gaze to settle upon the lily in the silver ewer he had noticed in the corridor. There was a twin arrangement here, a little showier, perhaps to appease the instrument's nerves. The lilies were white with a vindictiveness particular to their kind. "You had lilies in the corridor," he observed. "Mr. Hart insisted upon them," said Lady Otterline from the doorway. "He says they temper the gilding." She almost smiled. "He is often right when he is most sentimental." Julian Hart accepted the rebuke as if it had been composed for him. "Beauty must be vampiric to be worth the effort," he said, and then looked stricken, as if the phrase were suddenly indecent. Ashford let the remark trill and fade. He stepped back into the music room. The room wore rehearsal like a veil, a scatter of marked scores, a pencil bit through, a chair not quite returned to place, a shawl over the back of the conductor's stool, a triangle on a velvet cloth, ridiculous in its innocence. He stood still and let the tenor of the place speak. It did not cry, it never had, but he heard, as one hears undertones at a dinner after the servants have gone, The slight wrongness of a window set a hair's breadth ajar in a house that disliked draughts. The habit of the butler who collected glasses from left to right and had been hastily interrupted. The absence of a smudge one would expect upon a candlestick where someone steadying themselves might have touched. "All the windows in the house are kept closed in the evening," Ashford said, not asking. Arthur Pym inclined his head from his neutral territory. "Unless her ladyship instructs otherwise, sir. And this one, I closed it when I set the lamps. It appears to have slipped." "Does it often?" "No, sir." That was the first unkindness Pym had said all evening. No, he did not enlarge upon it. Ashford crossed back into the anteroom. He looked again at the metronome. Its pendulum arrested at a narrow tick, as if a great deal of restraint had been required, and then abandoned. He saw upon the folded program a smudge of something not ink, a faint, granular crescent where a forefinger had made purchase. Powder. He did not touch it. He stepped back. "I think," he said, "that we might all be more comfortable if we arranged ourselves. The music room for those present at the rehearsal, the small salon for those who joined later, the library for staff. Not an interrogation," he added, as if that assuaged anyone. "Merely quiet talk." They agreed as one agrees to the doctor's advice about rest, and in the same spirit. Rosamond Ashe rose at once and then sat again, undecided. Sir Peregrine roused from his colloquy with the window and squared his shoulders. Beatrice Mortlake flicked her pencil as if tuning it. Lanyard rearranged his pocket handkerchief and watched others arrange themselves. Julian Hart looked at his silvered cuff as if it had betrayed him. He tucked it away. Miss Crane and Mr. Pym abolished the last of the idle glasses, and in doing so revealed more of the room than others had seen. A small square of paper fell from beneath a score and slithered like a shy fish under the leg of a chair. Pym bent and retrieved it with the impersonal attention he would give to a crumb. He offered it to Ashford. A visiting card, Harold Grantley, Fellow of the Royal Orpheum Society. Not so remarkable in itself. The man was here. Somewhere, a shade late and then suddenly present earlier in the evening, and yet the card was folded once, very precisely, and then unfolded. Ashford turned it in his fingers and nodded as if someone had completed a useful phrase. "Mr. Grantley?" he asked. "On the telephone," said Miss Crane. "He was called away after the first ensemble, a director of sorts, numbers that are meant to terrify the rest of us." "He returned?" Ashford asked. "For the toast?" "No." Miss Crane hesitated. "He sent a note." "Which you have?" "In my desk," she said, with relief at having something that could be put into a drawer. Ashford replaced the card upon the sideboard as if it were one more small instrument to be used later. He let the room return to itself and turned to Lady Otterline. "May I ask that no one telephone beyond the necessary arrangements?" he said, not quite asking. "It will all only be worse in the papers if we are unprepared." "Miss Mortlake is here," said Lady Otterline dryly. "We shall be prepared in the morning with such accuracy as she deems fit." Beatrice Mortlake dipped her head. "I have the grace to be off duty," she said, which was a relief that threatened to be short-lived. Ashford offered moderate thanks to all, as if he had been assisted in choosing a suit. He stepped aside to allow the body to be removed to a private room, a courtesy share-out of solemnity between the dead and the house. As the small processional passed, he watched their faces. Grief was not absent. It simply wore gloves. In the corridor again, he paused before the solitary lily in the ewer. The droplet on the console had dried to a matte punctuation. He looked at the mark and then at Arthur Pym. "These arrangements, flowers, windows, lamps, are as they always are?" he asked, without pressure. "As far as I'm able, sir," Pym replied. "Mr. Fielding disliked scent. We had very few lilies until tonight." Julian Hart, who had wandered near like an apologetic comet, said, "I asked for them. The set needed cooling." He looked at the inspector with an artist's hope and panic. "You think me frivolous." "I think you observant," said Ashford. "You see how things sit with one another. It is an uncomfortable gift." Hart's relief resembled unhappiness in better clothes. Ashford returned to the small salon. He did not sit. He rested his hand for a moment upon the back of an empty chair. The house, the group, the air itself seemed to gather about that gesture, quiet and respectful, like a theatre at the fall of the Overture. He would ask his questions presently. For now, he knew the music one hears before anyone sings. The small, arranged silence in which a lie might feel its own pulse. He allowed it to play itself out, quite softly, and thought, without hurry, of a glass that had left its trace, of a window that would not, in this house, have been ajar by accident, and of a folded visiting card that had been folded more than once in a man's mind. "Thank you," he said to no one in particular and to everyone. "The library for the simple facts, the music room, later, for the complex ones. Miss Crane, the note, when you have it. Mr. Pym, the arrangements as you deem best. Lady Alleyn, you have been most helpful." He made of their movement from the room a small ceremony, as if the drama they had rehearsed had been postponed in favor of another, less tuneful, but infinitely more exacting. The evening, with something like relief, allowed itself to go on. Lady Honoria received him in the morning room with the slight rearrangement a woman makes when expecting an awkward visitor. The books moved, the flowers thinned, the chair's back offered rather than its seat. She wore the kind of mourning one puts on by anticipation, grey silk, uncompromisingly unpretentious. "Inspector," she said, and managed in the syllables, "respect without concession. Lady Honoria, may I be inquisitive in the fewest possible words? You may be whatever you like, provided you do not speak absurdly of tragedy in the presence of people who bought their handkerchiefs before they arrived." "I shall endeavour, ma'am." He smiled at the severity. It had kindness in it, dressed in discipline. "You have known Sir Giles long?" "Since he ceased to be merely promising." He had been promising a great many years. "Did he quarrel this evening?" "Is there any art by which one may succeed without quarrel?" "Yes. He quarrelled with Mr. Brooke in the least unprofitable way. Timing, emphasis, the length of an interval. Mr. Brooke is a man of mechanics, and Sir Giles believed in what he called necessity. They called each other names they had agreed upon in advance." "Ah," he let the sound float. "With Mr. Vale?" "Crispin? No. Sir Giles treated him as a man one would rob later if he were foolish, and encourage if he were not." "And with Dame Octavia?" Lady Honoria's mouth made a faint movement that could have been pity. "She and Sir Giles have been at war for 20 years. They exchange hostages. She asked for more lines that would resemble her. He asked for less of her that would resemble lines." "Very good," said Alleyn. "And Miss Bligh?" "Dorothy is his pair of hands, and the conscience he can look at." And he drank barley water. "Always. Whiskey made him sentimental. He feared that worse than death." Alleyn rose. "Thank you. You have a butler of enormous exactitude." "Yes." She looked him full in the face. "He will not tell you anything improper. If there is anything proper to tell, he will tell you that. You have read my profession very well, Lady Honoria." She permitted herself the smallest curve of amusement. "My profession, Inspector, has been to see people very slightly before they see me. Will you have Mr. Brooke?" Lionel Brooke came in with his dry urbanity intact, only the hair at his temple disordered as by a thoughtful hand. He sat not at all. He leaned against the mantel with a certain irony, as if the room were a theatre and Alleyn wrote the play. "It is a poor show, Inspector," he said. "There is no third act." "Do you want one?" "I always want one, but an ending is an ending." "You and Sir Giles differed on timings." "We differed on the length of silence between cues," said Mr. Brooke with a thin smile. "He was a poet. He wanted more emptiness on the stage." I said emptiness doesn't tour well. He told me that I had no courage. I told him he had no audience. We made peace after fashion. How? By making the same speech to different people. I told Miss Lascelles that her entrance would be a coronation. He told Mr. Vale that his music would speak while she refused us the right to breathe. The usual things. Did you visit him in the library? I did not. I have a superstition against disturbing men writing, owing to an incident in my youth that is not worth your time. Pym will tell you who went and came. He is a parish register. Where were you at 10:30, Mr. Brooke? In the music room, lecturing a cigar. I found it contemptuous and abandoned it. Alleyn allowed his eyes to flicker once, in an imitation of boredom. Mr. Brooke filled the pause, as men will who cannot endure unanswered questions. You suspect poison, he said. You're right, of course. Sir Giles was not a man to die kindly, even for himself. I could suppose one of a number of clever substances. It will do you no good. We are not clever in that way. We are cowards of different colors. Alleyn gave him nothing. And Miss Lascelles? She will tell you how magnanimous she has been and leave out how perfectly cruel. It is an art. I admire it. Crispin Vale came after, a young man who had washed his face of the previous night and found that the features were the same. Stephen Maskell held himself in the doorway, as if keeping time without being asked. Mr. Vale, said Alleyn, your music was very beautiful. Crispin colored. It's hardly. Thank you. You and Sir Giles? No quarrel? No. He said he would speak to me later, and if I were brave, I would be pleased afterwards. He always spoke like that, as if courage were a part in a play he had written. Were you brave? I don't know. I'm very tired of being young. What did you do after the performance? I spoke with Mr. Maskell and ate a little. Then I went to the piano again to look at a page that didn't like me. Miss Bligh passed with papers. Mr. Brooke spoke to Dame Octavia. It was all like talking while someone else slept. Did you go to Sir Giles in the library? Crispin looked at Stephen, who, with a barely perceptible nod, answered for him by not answering. Crispin said, No, I would not have dared. He liked to be alone when he was arranging your life. Alleyn smiled, just enough to be kind. And afterwards? Mr. Pym told us. Stephen Maskell spoke in his slow, careful way. Sir, he had a draught for his heart. He took it sometimes after a strain. I don't know whether that is anything, but he asked Miss Bligh earlier if she had brought the bottle. Did she? Yes? Alleyn's eyes returned to Crispin. You look, if you will forgive me, like a man with an unpracticed secret. Crispin's mouth trembled into something almost like laughter. I am a composer, Inspector. Our secrets are only lost notes. Keep them, then. But remember that secrets become heavier when you carry them alone. He let them go and asked for Dame Octavia, who came magnificently disciplined, wearing black not because it was required, but because it was entirely her. Inspector, she said, and sat. I do not like to be examined, but I enjoy examining the examiner. Let us be kind to one another, then, Alleyn suggested. Of course. She crossed a leg. The silk made a clean whisper. I shall be useful. I shall be generous. I shall be unintentionally revealing. Splendid. You and Sir Giles? We are each other's instruments. He was a harp of a peculiar pitch, I, a voice that does as it likes. We never quite escaped. He meant to cut me last night. I told him he would not, for the audience's sake. He pretended he had not the vanity to care. There you are. You saw him after the music? No, I spoke to Mr. Brooke, to whom I always speak when I need to know the shape of the world, and to Miss Bligh, whom I frighten because she has never been applauded. Then I smoked and thought about a line that sits badly in my mouth. You smoke long cigarettes. Are they long? They seem ordinary to me. I hold them as one holds grace. Did you notice anything unusual about Sir Giles during the performance? Any discomfort? He was as he always was, a man who refuses to be moved even as he is being moved. I saw him place his hand on his chest once. It might have been habit. It might have been a private emotion. Poets are full of them. Thank you. She rose, and as she did, she put out a hand for the chair back and, looking at him, did not take it. She let the hand hang instead, like a line left unspoken. Will there be a scandal? She asked lightly. There will be little enough to satisfy anyone, Alleyn said. Miss Dorothy Bly, at last, sat where Dame Octavia had refused to steady herself. She had tidy hair and eyes that had been red and were now merely loyal. Her hands folded so exactly that one could see where the pencil would have lain if she had been allowed to work while speaking. Miss Bly, Alleyn said gently, you are Sir Giles's vigilance. Her mouth moved. I'm his proper nouns, she said. He gives me the verbs. You brought his draft? Yes. He had asked me earlier to go to his rooms after luncheon and put it in my bag. We are careful with it. It tastes disagreeable. He likes that. He says it proves it's working. Where was the bottle during the evening? In my bag. He said he would call me if he needed it. He didn't call. Did you offer it? No, I do not suggest to him that he is fragile. He thinks it a vulgarity. Did anyone else know you had it? She hesitated. Mr. Brooke might. He knows everything. Lady Honoria would know that I am careful. Mr. Pym knows the contents of people, but I did not tell anyone. You passed the library? Yes. Twice. Once to carry the programs, once to fetch more pencils. He told me to keep the pencils sharp. He likes to see the point. Did you go in? No. She looked down. Inspector, I heard him cough once. Not like illness, like surprise, but it was only once. I did not go in. Alleyn allowed silence to do his work. She looked up quickly and then away again. I have his notebook, she said, in a small voice. He left it in my bag. He puts it there when he does not want anyone to know he has it with him. There is a page about last night. I have not read it. I couldn't. I thought you should have it first. Thank you, said Alleyn, and took it lightly, as one takes a leaf that might break. When she had gone, Fox came in with his slow tread. Well? He asked. Mr. Halberd is cautious. He says heart. He says also that hearts can be helped, Fox reported. He'll do for the moment. Alleyn turned the notebook in his hand, but did not open it. They are all very proper, he said. They are also, to an interesting degree, rehearsed. He looked towards the door through which Mr. Pym would eventually come. Let us see, he added, if anyone in this house knows how the barley water came to smell, ever so faintly, of almonds. The servants' hall at the back of the house had the calm of a chapel whose congregation had finished its responses and put its books aside. The flags were worn under the table where a score of years of shoes had rested, and the dresser gleamed with the pleasing vanity of an aged perfectionist. There was a faint, persistent odor of beeswax, coffee, and stove heat. Alleyn had always found that certain rooms kept the habits of a house as securely as a ledger's keep its numbers. He stood a moment in the doorway, as if to acclimatize himself. Mr. Pym, the butler, rose without haste. He was one of those men bred to a post, not so much older than the new century. The very carriage of his back suggested ceremonial silver and decanters that were never allowed to be empty. He had the even countenance of a confidant who sympathizes and never betrays. His hands were folded, but not submissively. "Inspector," he said, and gave the smallest possible intimation of deference with his head. "Mr. Pym, would you consider a cup of coffee a breach of the peace?" Alleyn asked. Pym's eye moved to the pot. "I should not, sir. Mrs. Bly, if you please." The housekeeper came in from the passage with an air that balanced affront and concern. She was neat, visibly so, with the sort of neatness that plotters distrust. A younger maid trailed behind her, sent back again with a glance. Alleyn sat at the far corner of the table, where the light from the high window fell across the ledger that lay closed near Mr. Pym's elbow. He did not touch the ledger. He had no need to. "It is my practice," Mr. Pym said, "to keep the household routine unchanged as far as possible. In distressing circumstances, the staff takes comfort in familiarity." "Very wisely," Alleyn said. "I am grateful to fall in with it. Shall I intrude upon your familiarity in asking for a recital of last night's measures? Yours, that is. The things you do without thinking, which one always remembers best." Mrs. Bligh set a cup by his hand and took the seat she knew was hers when policemen came. She held her, fingers in a precise arrangement, like a picture of prayer. "Very good, sir," Mr. Pym said. The concert was to begin at 8. Refreshments in the blue drawing-room at 7:30. At 7:15 the footmen took up the sherry and the little savouries, and Mrs. Bligh's kitchen maids saw to the hot. The music room was in my charge. I laid out the programmes and the reserved seats. The instrument had been tuned that afternoon by Mr. Hargood as arranged, and the green baize cover replaced. "You took it off?" "I did, sir, at 7:20. The music was arranged upon the stand, as you'll have seen. Mr. He paused, and the neutral gaze altered by a fraction. The gentleman who died was in the small ante-room adjoining, with Mr. Swithin, the stage director, and the lady vocalist. I brought in the lemon and honey, as is usual for singers. The hot water later. Mrs. Bligh inserted, "It was my kettle, sir. I keep it separate for such, and I take credit for that, though heaven knows I wish I hadn't today." "Just so," said Alleyn. "And the lemon?" "I cut it myself," she returned, and the phrase had an almost heroic simplicity. "Particulars for stage folk. They notice." "They do," Alleyn agreed. "And the honey?" "It's kept in the smaller pantry in a jar with a glass lid," Mr. Pym said. "I keep it because of flies, sir, and because anyone will meddle with a tin." "You fetched it last night?" "I did not, sir." He had the air of a man who had considered the likely question and regretted it for half an hour. "I had sent Barker, the second footman, earlier in the evening. When I went myself at the time, the jar was on the tray and the lid was in place. And no one else would have used it between times." "There are persons," Mrs. Bligh said tranquilly, "who will put their fingers into anything. But not my maids last night. I set them where they could be seen." "It would be immodest," Mr. Pym said, very smooth, "to suggest that the staff are naturally conscientious, but I may say that they are." Alleyn took a sip. The coffee was proper and had not suffered for having been bred below stairs. He made a small, appreciative sound. "Thank you," he said, and cradled the cup so that his gaze might fall downward and not be thought inquisitive. The glass in the music room, on the little table to the left of the instrument. "Who put it there?" "I did," Mr. Pym said at once. "For Mr. Swithin. He takes a light white wine on account of nerves." "Riesling?" "A Moselle, sir. We keep a case on hand for that purpose." "Very civilized. He drank it, I suppose." "I noticed the ring on the table afterward," Mr. Pym said, "so I must suppose so." Alleyn waited a heartbeat longer than comfort demanded. Silence, in the right company, is a set of bellows. It makes small fires spread. Mrs. Bligh's folded hands tightened and loosened. "You would not, Mr. Pym, have set out a glass of anything else?" He had the courage to look him in the face. "I did not. There was a second glass, for the lady vocalist, of barley water with a squeeze. She tasted it and did not take more. And for the gentleman," he had his own bottle, Inspector, the throat lozenges. He was never without them. "Indeed, the black pastilles." "Little ovals in a tin," said Mrs. Bligh. "A man came with a parcel for him in the afternoon. I signed, as Mr. Pym was upstairs." "Very good. And to go back. The green baize. The key for the instrument cupboard." "In my pocket," Mr. Pym said, and showed it attached to a chain. "There is a second in the plate safe, but I have not had. That is to say, Nobody has asked me for it in months. Who has access to the plate safe? The mistress, said Mrs. Bligh, and one felt the capital letter even though she had not used it, and Mr. Pym and myself. The keys are in our keeping, as the gentleman who supplies the insurance will have explained. There was a movement along the passage, the particular shuffle of cheap leather on linoleum. A head bobbed round the door, round-eyed and penitential, and then withdrew itself with a jerk when it met 3 pairs of level eyes. Mr. Pym did not turn. That, he said, with the dignity of a man accustomed to curtailing the antics of junior clergy, was Barker. He is in disgrace for talking. Alleyn allowed himself his smile. He might talk to me. I would prefer, Mr. Pym said, that he talk sense to anyone. Send him in, said Mrs. Bligh firmly, and rose to do it. Mr. Pym accepted the interposition with the smallest possible shift of weight. Barker came in, cheeks blazing and ears aflame. He was a youth manufactured by the city out of the country, with hands too big for his livery and a heart on his sleeve. He looked at Alleyn as if the help of a gentleman might be a thing like a church, always there but seldom visited. "Well, Barker," Alleyn said, "you were sent for honey." "Yes, sir," Barker said. "Only the honey wasn't where it ought to be when I first went, sir. Not where it ought to be. In the small pantry cupboard, as Mr. Pym says, sir. Mrs. Bligh knows I'm not one to pry. I called out, and Miss Avery, beg pardon, sir, the secretary. She said, 'Use mine. It's in my drawer, but for heaven's sake don't take the lot.' Begging her pardon, sir." There was a small electric quiver. Mr. Pym's left eyelid fluttered and steadied. Mrs. Bligh stared fixedly at the teacups and said nothing. "Miss Avery keeps honey?" Alleyn said. "Does she sing?" "No, sir," Barker said, startled. "It's for her throat when she writes. She keeps late hours. She said afterward as how she'd rather not be mixed." He stopped. "Do go on," Alleyn murmured. "She said she'd rather not be mixed into kitchen matters." Barker gulped. "Very natural," said Alleyn. "Did you, later on, notice whether the house honey had been returned to its rightful place?" "Yes, sir," Barker said with unhappy promptitude. "It was there when I went the second time. For the hot water, only—" Barker's youth battled honor. He had not been taught to have opinions in front of his superiors and was trying very hard to comply. "Only?" Alleyn repeated. "Only the lid was sticky, sir. It don't get sticky in our pantry. Mrs. Bligh don't allow it. So I wiped it, sir, and I'm sorry if I oughtn't to have." Mrs. Bligh compressed her lips, but not with fury. "You did right," she said. "We don't have mess." "Nor do we," Mr. Pym said very quietly, "have liberties," which might have been to Alleyn or to the universe. "Was anyone else below stairs around that time?" Alleyn asked. "Between 7 and 8, say." Mrs. Bligh and Mr. Pym exchanged one of those looks that are not looks. It was the glance of colleagues whose religion forbids betrayal. "The dresser from the theatre," Mrs. Bligh said after a moment. "Nell. She popped in for a pin cushion and a mouthful of something. I told her she'd get a mouthful of the back of my hand if she didn't go where she belonged. She laughed. She's one as laughs. And the stage doorkeeper," Mr. Pym said, as if he read in a book that he must say so. "Mr. Tuke. He came with a message for Mr. Swithin and waited while Barker went to announce him. I should not have known, but I saw his hat on our bench." He paused. "I put it in the passage." "Because," Alleyn said, "it didn't belong here." "No, sir," Mr. Pym said. "It did not." He lifted the ledger at last and opened it, not ostentatiously, and not for Alleyn's benefit, but as a man will open a prayer book when the service requires it, and only then. His finger ran down the neat columns. Wine, glasses, trays, bells. The bellboard on the wall, a varnished frame with named rooms and an obliging semi-quaver of a tremor in its last summons, was silent. Everything spoke of the mechanical virtue of habit. Alleyn's eye had been caught, earlier, by a pale ring on a tin tray near the scullery door. It was the ring left by a bottle, not a glass. There were 3 such rings, in fact, nested like moons in reflection. They were wiped now, but not by a professional. He filed it among the fragments that accumulate like the small stones in the corners of old steps. "You will forgive me," he said, "to the room and to the people in it, if I seem to ask what your employers would rather I did not. Your loyalty is not lost on me." Mrs. Bligh lifted her round eyes, astonished that a gentleman should put it so plainly. Mr. Pym merely inclined his head. "We have our order, sir," he said. "We are proud of it." "And order," Alleyn said with a touch of dryness, "is the making of many, a case as well as the making of a household." He rose then, leaving the coffee half finished because it is a tactful way of suggesting one will return. At the door he turned back. "Mr. Pym," he said, "the clock over the dresser. It is 2 minutes fast. Is that by design?" "It is, sir," Mr. Pym said after the smallest of pauses. "It keeps us up to the house. The drawing-room timepiece is 2 minutes slow. Her ladyship," the capital letter again, "prefers it, sir. The master of ceremonies," and his voice richened with unoffending irony, "must always be early." "Very proper," said Alleyn. He smiled at them and saw very clearly the adjustment in their faces, as if they had revised something to include him. He carried with him up the corridor the knowledge that what had been said was less than what had been thought, and that in the careful economy of this household, silence was a coin they spent rarely and with sovereign caution. In the little anteroom off the music-room he paused. Beyond, the piano stood with its lid lifted like a wing. On the chair where the dead man had sat someone, Mrs. Bligh, almost certainly, had laid a folded cloth discreetly. He thought of the sticky honey lid, the secretary's private store, the absent-minded stage doorkeeper's hat, and the precise difference of 4 minutes between below stairs and above. Fox would have said, "What do you make of that, Mr. Alleyn?" He would say, "Not yet," and go to find Miss Avery. In the early hush of Belgrave Square, the Vale House achieved its morning shape with a practiced discretion that Alleyn found not unlike the orchestration of a courtly overture. Doors were eased open and closed, carpets brushed in long, contemplative strokes, and somewhere at the core the pulse of the kitchen gave a comfortable punctuation to absence. The rooms themselves had drawn their breath after the event. Candles replaced, flowers revived, satinwood rubbed to a bloom that suggested it had never known a finger mark. What remained was the impression of last night's pattern, an outline as faint and exact as a drawing pricked through with a pin. Alleyn stood in the small music-room near the Heppel-White chair, which had the look of having recovered its own composure. He glanced at the low satinwood table with its oval top where a silver coaster had left a tidy ring. Swithin, who had been summoned and came with that grave air of a man called upon to assert the house's honour, waited by the door. "If you please," Alleyn said, "would you set out the refreshment tray as you did last evening at about 9:30? There is no need to bring the actual bottles. The placing will do." "Very good, sir," said Swithin. His eyelids lowered for a moment over eyes that had assessed Alleyn and found him unsensational. He went away and returned with the great lacquered tray and a precision that was not unlike ceremony. It was oddly moving, Alleyn thought, given what lay beneath the courtesy. First came the rummers, clear and heavy in the hand, 4 on one side, 4 on the other. Between them Swithin set 2 tumblers with thick bottoms. "For Sir Julian, sir," he said, touching one glass with his finger. "Barley water, his throat, and occasionally Mr. Dean's man will bring his own mixture in a flask. Mr. Pennington never took barley water." "How many rummers did you set out last night?" 8, sir. There were 6 guests and 2 for chance." "The coasters?" Swithin, with a delicate economy of movement, took a pile of coasters from the tray's drawer. There were 2 sorts, crisp squares of white linen with a tiny scalloped edge, and plain, fine damask circles with an embroidered dot. "The ladies, sir, have the scallops. The gentleman, the plain. It is her ladyship's notion and gives a neatness to a room. Last night? As arranged, sir. And the order? Alleyn asked. Indulge me, Mr. Swithin. Suppose we are at that moment last night. Set them as you set them then. Swithin did so, placing the 4 scalloped coasters at the near edge of the tray, where the ladies might take them. The damask were further back, for the gentlemen. The 2 tumblers sat, oddly apart, at the left. It is my habit, sir, to hand Mr. Dine his tumbler. He prefers to take it in his own time. I then carry the tray to the group. I hold it in this manner. He showed Alleyn the tilt of the tray, the slight recessing of the left hand, the forward offer from the right, the musculature of a ritual. Last night you did precisely this. Precisely, sir. Who took the first glass? The young lady, sir. Miss Harcourt, then Mr. Felix. Dr. Lazenby asked for ginger ale, which I obtained from the pantry. Mr. Pennington said he would wait. Sir Julian said he would not begin until after his second recitation. Her ladyship declined. Alleyn remembered the arrangements, the laugh after the Brahms, the little delay while someone found a shawl, the subdued amusement at Sir Julian's dependence on barley water. All of them had seemed to consent to a polite rhythm that now looked, from this angle, dangerously exploitable. After Mr. Pennington said he would wait, did he in fact take a glass? I could not say, sir. I set the tray on this table as her ladyship directed. I do not leave it on the card table. Swithin's glance admitted by omission that there was a protocol for card tables, and that the satinwood had a status. Alleyn moved the satinwood table a fraction. There, along the sheen of the rim, was a hairline of white cotton as if a thread had caught and persisted. He took out his loop. The thread was scarcely a fragment, but he imagined the brush of a cuff, the slight drag. He released it. "Your coasters," he said, "and the white on the table. The plain coasters were for the gentlemen, and the scalloped for the ladies." He traced, without touching, the faint condensation mark that had darkened the grain and left its round. The trace, minute a whisper, showed a scalloped edge. "Sir," said Swithin, after a silence in which he had undoubtedly followed Alleyn's gaze, "that is not correct. No. The scallops, sir, as you perceive, have left an impression. The glass that stood there, last night, stood upon a lady's coaster. It would not be my arrangement for a gentleman." Alleyn looked at him mildly. "And a gentleman did stand there?" "Yes, sir." "Mr. Pennington?" "Yes, sir." They were quiet. Alleyn felt the little lift at the back of his mind that always accompanied what his late mother had called his unpardonable luck. It was not luck, of course. It was the recognition of a small impropriety in a world that maintained its proprieties as defenses. "You have another habit," he said. "Do you keep any glass with a tiny defect from general use?" Swithin's pause. Here was not reticence, but the surprise of being known. "There is a rummer with a chip at the foot, sir. It is not visible to a guest. I place it, as a rule, on a side table so I may take it if I myself require a glass. It is her ladyship's custom that staff do not drink while engaged. But," he admitted, "one grows considerate of one's throat." "And last night?" "Last night I put it on the side table in the large drawing-room behind the screen." Alleyn went himself to look and found the side table with its screen that showed a Chinese peacock with an improbable tail. On the table was the telltale circle of dried water, and beside it the faintest crescent scratched into the polish where a chipped foot might have caught. The rummer itself was not present. "When was the tray removed from this room?" After, sir. Once the police had finished." "Who removed it?" "I did, sir, and Miss Beale was with me. It is Miss Beale's practice to see that nothing of her ladyship's is mislaid." "Miss Beale," Alleyn said, as if tasting a mild wine and finding it interesting, "is attentive." "She is so, sir." Alleyn returned to the small music room. He bent again over the satinwood, and this time abolished of squeamishness by long habit, brought the tabletop level with his nose. Parma violets, just at the faintest limit of suggestion. He had smelt that particular shy sweetness at intervals last evening when Miranda Harcourt had passed, when Lady Honoria had leaned in to murmur to Sir Julian, when Miss Beale had brushed by in her officious darting. It was a fashionable scent. It was none. And yet the coaster's scallop and the ghost of a perfume on a place where Mr. Pennington had set down his glass made a trifling, stubborn sense. He looked about him. The metronome on the mantel had been set again, its polished wood as self-satisfied as any well-conducted dependency. He set it to tick and watched the arm. 2 beats, 3, 4. He stopped it, and in the silence that replaced its scruple, there was the softest whisper of a letter being slid under a door somewhere down the passage. The minute, prosaic sounds of a house at work. "Swithin," he said, "we shall take away the coasters and the rummer with the chip if it is found. Her ladyship will be put to as little inconvenience as possible." "Yes, sir. And I should like to know who, last night, would have presumed to correct your arrangements. It is a sin in a house like this, is it not?" "I would not say sin, sir," Swithin said, with the faintest deploring movement. "But it is not the thing." "Not the thing," Alleyn repeated, and smiled with one side of his mouth. He had sometimes the sense that a case in such a world required of him not a rigid cross-examination so much as a participation in a ritual whose rules he must first apprehend. The tray, the coasters, the chipped glass, they were steps in a minuet, and someone, last night, had altered the figure. He found Miss Beale in the library with a ledger open, and the crisp air of a woman who cannot trust to the fidelity of others. She stood at once. "You will forgive me," Alleyn said. "A small question. Last night, when you and Mr. Swithin cleared the tray, did you notice if any glass was missing from those set out?" Miss Beale's eyes, which were not attractive eyes, pushed against his with a brittle patience. "Mr. Swithin is meticulous. I did not count. I saw one glass on the side table beside the screen. I took it and put it with the others. As it happened, Inspector, it had a flaw. I remarked on it." "You put it with the others?" "Yes." "On which shelf is this glass ordinarily kept?" "In the butler's pantry," said Miss Beale with a faint triumph. "On the top shelf. Mr. Swithin knows quite well the proper order. But I saw, yesterday afternoon when we cleaned, that this one had been put with the lower set, which, as I gather," Alleyn murmured, "are used for servants' meals." Miss Beale looked gratified. "Yes. And who cleans the pantry?" "The under-parlour maid, under Mr. Swithin's supervision." Alleyn let it rest. He felt again the almost imperceptible lightness at the back of his mind. The chipped glass had been moved from its exile to the general set. Someone, anticipating, had promoted it, so that its absence from the side table, if it were pressed into other service, would not be noted, or to make its presence among the ordinary rummers unnoticed when the tray was cleared, a contingency prepared for by someone who understood Mr. Swithin's small punctilios, a person of the house, or one who had listened to the house. He took up his hat and, before he left the library, saw on the desk a pile of programs from last night. He turned over the top one with a finger. The second page, the Overture, had its corner turned down and, in a faint pencil, a word, "sick." It might have been a scholar's intervention. It might have been a small rebuke to Felix's tempo. It might have been nothing whatever to do with a dead man in a Hepplewhite chair. In the passage, a maid was stooping for the letter that had been pushed under the door. She presented it to him shyly, uncertain of correctness. It was addressed to Lady Honoria in an ink that had not yet settled. He gave it back to her. "Take it to Miss Beale," he said, "and tell Mr. Swithin I should be grateful if he would leave the pantry as it is for the moment." Outside, the square had resumed its decorum. A woman passed with a small, smooth dog. A window was drawn up for some air. It was shut again. Alleyn, at the steps, touched the brim of his hat to a world that permitted itself so many guilts only under proper cover. He would send Fox to the chemist at the corner and to the bottle merchant who supplied Lady Honoria. He would have the coasters examined and the chipped rummer searched for among the glass, where Miss Beale had conscientiously introduced it. But far more useful, he thought, would be to sit again this afternoon and go through, as if in a play, the entrances and exits. Who took what when? Who corrected Swithin's harmless ornament? Who found a front in the order of trays? He smiled at the pretentiousness of his theatre and walked down the steps. The day, that had begun with a ritual, was promising him a second performance. He suspected the interval would not be restful. The first post came up the steps as if it knew how to behave in Portland Place. The letters, domestic and discreet, lay in a small lacquered tray that Merridew set down upon the edge of the breakfast table with the indifference of a man who has handled the private lives of his employers for an unconscionable number of years. Outside, rain made a fine mesh upon the drawing-room windows and rendered the tall plane trees an impression in watery graphite. Alleyn, who had slept under the barracks roof at Sir Lionel's earnest request, sat with his coffee untouched and observed the room. Lady Berwick, rigidly neat at the hour when lesser mortals surrender to a dressing-gown, buttered a roll with a surgeon's exactitude. Julia, without makeup, her hair in a modest coil and her face unaccountably gentler in daylight, toyed with a cut grapefruit, and Miss Crane, the secretary, ate nothing and stared with zeal at the marmalade as if it might be induced to confess. Sir Lionel, who had apparently been restless throughout the small hours and was now conducted by something less than the sum of his nervous energies, took up the lacquered tray with the air of a man receiving tributes from a conquered province. "Bills," he muttered. "Appeals." He paused. "What's this?" "Ah, Kellett." He held up a heavy cream envelope. Eyes drifted towards it and drifted away again, with that studied vacancy that the well-bred employ when the stakes are personal. Merridew, who had placed the tray with no more expression than might have attended the setting down of a coal scuttle, moved backwards, faultless. "Postmarked late," Sir Lionel said. His voice did nothing to disguise the tremor in his hand. "Last clearance, from Jermyn Street. He might have sent it from his rooms." He glanced at Alleyn, deferential without capitulation. "If you'll forgive, this may bear on last night." "By all means," Alleyn said. Sir Lionel slit the envelope with a bone knife and unfolded the single sheet. The paper made a minute, expensive sound. The silence that followed it had texture. Lady Berwick took a sip of coffee. Julia stopped fidgeting with her spoon. Miss Crane forgot the marmalade. Sir Lionel read. His eyebrows lifted, then came down and converged. He looked at the signature, and then at Alleyn, as if to say that the universe, having mismanaged its affairs in one respect, now proposed a supplement. He passed the paper across. Alleyn took it carefully. The hand was an educated, rather ornate script that long practice had worked towards the illegible without quite arriving there. The note itself was brief. "My dear Sir Lionel, our conversation has made the necessary thing plain. I set it down, that you may act without the inconvenience of my presence. I must withdraw from the first performances. If your patience will stretch to this, I will leave your admirable enterprise the freer for it. If you will take my advice, forgive the vanity. Let Vale conduct. It is his temperament and it is his right. Miss Archer will not do for reasons of health and constancy. Perhaps we look closer to home. Miss Julia has an aptness not to be overlooked. Believe me yours, etc. Maurice Kellett." It was not the content, but the tone that gave the note its malignancy. It performed a tidy surgery upon reputations, bestowed a baton, and offered a polite wound to the girl at the table. Julia had gone very still. Lady Berwick put down her cup as if it had become unexpectedly heavy. Sir Lionel said, in a voice he must have practiced, "Extraordinary." Miss Crane, who had paled at the sight of Kellett's hand, recovered herself and leaned over Sir Lionel's shoulder. "May I? Mr. Kellett dictated much of his correspondence to me. There is—" "What do you make of it?" Alleyn asked. She seemed to consider, rejected the first answer that came to her tongue. One could almost see it, and said, Mr. Kellett was capable of cruelty. It would have amused him to call it frankness, but this, no. The phrasing is his almost to pastiche, but he never used performances without the article, nor temperament for what he called temper. And he would have underlined right. He underlined too much. She directed a white look at the paper. The M of Maurice is wrong. Alleyn had already noticed that the pen had passed, but not returned where Kellett's mannerism invariably returned. He did not mention it. "Jermyn Street," Sir Lionel said. "Miss Crane, have the goodness to ring and ask whether we had any messenger from Mr. Kellett last night." "I looked," Miss Crane said in a flat, unsecretarial tone. "The book shows none." Sir Lionel's voice frayed. "Then what does this mean?" "It would seem, sir," Merridew offered from his invisible position a respectful yard beyond the door, "that the first post fetched it from the late clearance." "Who posted it?" Sir Lionel said to the note, as if it might be goaded into a reply. "And why?" Alleyn examined the paper with his unromantic magnifying glass. The paper was not of Kellett's usual sort. He had held one of Kellett's letters last night from a pocket-book that Merridew, under instruction, had laid upon the music-room table. It had been eggshell and faintly ribbed. This was smooth, heavier, and bore the watermark of a Bond Street stationer that sold more optimism than paper. The ink was blue-black. He had noticed Kellett's pen left a sepia trail, the sort of affectation a conductor permits himself before he becomes a great man, or when he believes himself so. "Did Mr. Vale go out last night?" he asked, without looking up. It was impossible to say which one of them reacted. One does not pounce in the Portland places. Julia made an absurd little sound. Very small, like a thought coughed. Lady Berwick did not move. Sir Lionel said, "We none of us slept. The young men smoked in the library after you had finished, Inspector. Sebastian may have gone onto the balcony. If you suppose—" "I suppose nothing," Alleyn said. "It would be tidier if we knew whether any of the company went out after 11. Miss Crane found her voice from somewhere tight. "Mr. Vale left at 11:45 with Mr. Drayton," she said. "They quarrelled by the front door like schoolboys about a cadence. Mr. Drayton said he would not have his column bullied by a phrase. Mr. Vale told him he had no ear. Mr. Drayton said he had no taste. Merridew will corroborate." "If you please," Merridew agreed. "And after?" Alleyn asked. "Mr. Vale returned," Miss Crane said, with that awful precision of the conscientious, at 12:20 to fetch his scarf. "I knew because I had come down to the writing room. I had left a page in the typewriter." Alleyn waited. "I had left a page in the typewriter," she repeated softer, "and when I went back to remove it, I saw that someone had pressed the bar and inked a capital among the ghosts." She looked at him almost defiantly. "I'm a fool about such things." "You are very much not," Alleyn said. Sir Lionel's hand moved. "This does not prove," he began, and then, "My God, the opening is a fortnight distant. Without Kellett, we are made ridiculous." Lady Berwick said, quietly, "Leo—" "There's no need," he said, and shut his mouth upon the rest. He turned to Julia with a courtly misery. "My child." Julia, who had recovered her colour, managed a smile that must have cost her something. If it is a joke, it is a poor one. If it is meant to be kind, it is worse. Am I expected to curtsy to Mr. Vale in the drawing-room when he confers on me atop C? "Miss Archer is not ill," Lady Berwick said. "She is temperate as a nun and only capricious when somebody tells her to be. Someone wishes to clear 2 people away and hoist a 3rd. Sir Lionel flinched. "Evelyn." "It is the logic of the note," she said. Alleyn put the letter in an envelope and rose. With your leave, Sir Lionel, I'll keep this for the moment. He smiled at Meridew. Would you take me to the writing room? Meridew, in whose demeanor there was, if one wished to see it, a faint share in the ironies of the day, conducted him down the corridor to a room too modest to be called a library and too proud for an office. A desk of burr walnut bore a blotter under a mother-of-pearl paper knife. Alleyn bent over it as if the maple wood floor had acquired an interest. The blotting paper had been turned. He lifted the top flap, and under it, backwards as in an aquarium, lay fragments of the letter's phrases: temperament, performances, Miss Julia, impressed in a neat, ghostly script. The letter had been composed here, or at least signed here. He put his finger near, not on, the words, and the smell of decent ink rose with the suggestion of violets. He said, "It is a useful and injudicious habit, Miss Crane, to test a line in the blotting paper before committing it to posterity. May I?" Miss Crane, who had followed and stood taut as the wire of a score, nodded. "Meridew, who else comes in here at night?" "No one should, sir." "Ah," Alleyn said. "But last night?" Meridew put his head a trifle to one side. "It is not my habit, sir, to speculate upon the travels of others. If a person desired to write a note, the key is in the tray. Persons have desired, from time to time." From the corridor, a footfall, and Sebastian Vale himself shouldered the half-open door with the unconscious propriety of the artist in a patron's house. He was wearing a scarf looped twice, in defiance of the season, and his face had that luminous voracity that is the privilege and the ruin of talent. "Inspector," he said, "is it permitted?" "Always," Alleyn said. "We speak of notes." "Ah," Vale said. "There are too many, if you ask me. That is the mischief of society. I walked and tried to hear my theme without it. One can't write with a house thrumming like a hive. Drayton buzzes. Sir Lionel hums money. Miss Crane clicks at her keys like a metronome. It is not the sound I want." "Where did you walk?" Alleyn asked. Vale smiled. "St. James's. The rain is admirable, don't you think? It washes the mind and leaves behind the lines." "Did you go by Jermyn Street?" Alleyn asked very gently. Vale showed his teeth like a boy's. "I might have. I went in a circle. I don't remember my geography when I'm hearing things. Why? Are there to be maps now?" "There is a letter," Alleyn said, "in Mr. Kellett's hand." "Ah," Vale said again, but the sound this time had an inward turn. "He withdrew?" It would be of a piece with his temper. He loved to retire from positions he had previously assumed. "He appears to have recommended that you should conduct," Alleyn said, "and that Miss Archer should be supplanted, perhaps by Miss Julia." Vale's hands moved as if he had played a chord and disliked it. "It is a monstrous joke." "Is it?" Alleyn asked. "It is odious," Vale said with sudden heat, "because it makes what is generous look rapacious, and what is necessary look mean. I will not conduct because a dead man ghost writes his malice." "You will not be required to," Sir Lionel said from the doorway. He had come without noise, and his presence chilled the temperature of the room. Lady Berwick was behind him, and with her Mr. Drayton, who looked as if he relished nothing so much as the appearance of disaster at breakfast. Drayton bowed to Alleyn with a lively eye. "We are to have documents. How agreeable. I'm always relieved when a crime enters the realm of the literary." Lady Berwick said, "We have had a note. Now we have an absence." "An absence?" Alleyn turned to her. "Miss Archer has vanished. Her maid came to report that she is not in her room. Her bed has been lain upon, not slept in. There is no hat missing, and no cloak." Alleyn glanced at Meridew, who alone looked unastonished. "She will have left quietly," Lady Berwick went on, "because she does everything quietly. She will return equally quietly. But since we are gathering threads, her maid," Alleyn said, "may I speak with her?" "Of course." "Oh," Drayton murmured, "how things improve. A forged letter and now a vanishing prima donna. It begins to resemble a program one might actually attend. "Do be quiet, Hugo," Lady Berwick said. She looked at Alleyn. "You see, Inspector, the letter is a stone in a calm pond. We had best count the circles." Alleyn, with his hand still light on the blotter, considered the pattern that the morning was drawing for him. The letter's phrases shivered like reeds in the paper's mirror. They meant to press his attention upon certain names and away from others. That in itself was an attention. "Miss Crane," he said, "do you keep carbons of everything you type?" "Of course," she said, "except what is dictated after dinner. Sir Lionel does not care to have copies of private matters, and Mr. Kellett despised the mechanical repetition of his opinions." "Yet someone has repeated them," Drayton said sweetly. "Not quite," Alleyn said. "Someone has approximated them." He looked up and found Vale's eyes on him. For an instant they were naked, and then the lids came down and the artist returned to stand where the man had been. "I should like to see Miss Archer's room," Alleyn said. "After that, perhaps, the footman who was on duty at the front door between 11 and 1. And if anyone would find it fatiguing to be asked whether they left the house, perhaps they will relieve me of the necessity by telling Merridew. He will tell me in his own time and his own way." Merridew, in receipt of this remarkable compliment, inclined his head. Outside, the rain made its quiet industry upon Portland Place. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed a quarter. The acoustics were such that it seemed to have chimed in the next room. Alleyn folded the false note into its envelope and slipped it, with a small rap of his knuckle, into the inner pocket of his coat. He suspected that in this house, where the polite and the necessary had long been taught to share a plate, the second sound would shortly follow the first. The pond had more than one stone. The theatre, when it has emptied itself of voices and costume and the metallic laughter of properties, is a structure of breath. It inhaled the day, and now exhaled it in little draughts that worked coolly along the aisles and crept under the velvet flap of a curtain. Alleyn sat in the fourth row of the stalls, at the place where one's neck must tilt a fraction to see the proscenium squarely, and watched the ghostlight make an icicle of the center stage. Above, the house seemed to listen. Below, the orchestra pit was a dark trench in which the score's handwriting slept. Fox, solid and patient at his shoulder, had put his notebook away. He sat with his big hands coupling and uncoupling each other gently, his head bent as if he attended upon something not yet articulate. At length, because silence with Fox could be companionable to the point of collusion, Alleyn said, "There's an odd comfort in an empty theatre. One feels the day is obliged to confess itself." Said Fox, "if it's had time to make up the lies." "Quite. How did Mrs. Baines fare?" "She looked earlier as if she had lost her favorite tea cosy." "Mrs. Baines will not commit herself," Fox said solemnly. "She has been for 20 years a dresser upon whom actresses depend for their notion of their own faces. She says he was a tidy gentleman. She says he always clicked the little lid twice. She will say nothing more." "Tidy," Alleyn repeated, gazing at the ghost light. "Mrs. Baines is more observant than she realizes." From the stage, the prompt desk rose like a pulpit in a bare church. He could picture Miss Pym at it, quick and discreet, with her spy's glance, an ear for the cue, a voice that could thread a whisper through a quarrel. Miss Pym would have said, as she had said, that the 5-minute call was a sacrament. "I never vary it, Mr. Alleyn," she had told him, trill thin. "Cues are character. If you alter the cue, you unmake the person." "Sir." His memory made a gesture, as if laying out props carefully. The silver tin of pastilles, the opera glasses with their smooth blackened lenses, the white camellia folded into tissue, the thin smell of orris powder. In all of them a quiet hand had troubled the dust. In all of them he had felt the lightest, most obstinate imposition of will. "Sir," Fox said, because Alleyn had lifted his head a fraction. "There was another thing. Hargreaves, Lockett, Alleyn corrected mildly. Sir Edward's man is Locket. Right you are. Locket. He mentioned the umbrella. He did, Alleyn said. He mentioned it by not mentioning it. He held it with more respect than he held his hat. Fox cleared his throat in a way that meant he would not press. Locket, in his starched discretion, had been the picture of correct ignorance. The impeccable line of the trouser, the mute shoes, the glance that refused to make connections. And yet, in his manageable way, he had drawn attention to a thing that other people might have called trivial. Sir Edward had come to the theatre in rain and had not used his umbrella when he left his car. He never left it in the green room, yet there it had been. Locket had removed it and said nothing. One does not speak of what one tidies. Fox, Alleyn said after a small pause, do you remember the sound Miss Pym objected to? The click, said Fox. The little click she heard when Mr. Arbery was on stage and Sir Edward wasn't in his chair. Yes, the click that should have been 2 clicks but was only 1. Miss Pym has the timing of a metronome. She hears irregularities like an organist hears flats. It wasn't the click that matters, so much as the ear that heard it and the hand that made it. A hand accustomed to managing small metallic closures. A hand that refuses to leave a thing uncompleted. Fox's silence expressed approval without comprehension. He would wait, as he always waited, for Alleyn to bring disparate smallnesses into a pattern. He thought of them. The primitive, childlike faith in routine. The way even the most capricious of the company held to their own superstitions with fierce exactitude. Julian Arbery, who would not go on without touching the half-moon gouge on the prompt table with his little finger. Miss Martin, who looked at herself in the long glass from the left side only. Sir Basil Herrick, with his grotesque dignity, who always walked on stage at the same angle when speaking to a principal. The composer, Fortescue, who gave the A to the orchestra himself, a fraction flatter than concert, because he believed perfection vulgar. And Sir Edward, there was the strangest fervency of all. Sir Edward with his 2 clicks on the pastille box and his opera glasses turned in, lenses cushioned as if they were scandalized. One of these rituals had been mimicked. One had been used. He knew it not from any flamboyance, but from a small miserliness of gesture. The camellia, perhaps, was the least of it. The white flower, that faint, not quite scent, had been placed, not given. All the same, Miss Martin's hands had trembled when she touched the tissue, and then she had folded the paper precisely along the crease that had already existed. One learns a person by their folding. There had been the second disturbance, quiet and vexing, like a cough at the back of the house. A letter had come, a letter that was all edges and mimicry. Fox had brought it to him with large caution and had said, "Looks right, sir." It looked right, but the G in darling had more curl than the tired man whose love had been economical. It had sent Miss Martin to the stage door at a time when the stage door would be a corridor of drafts and witnesses, and she had gone, because people in love will moderate their own intelligence if you give them a ceremony. It was not the forgery that had mattered, but the fact that someone in this house understood that love can share a bell with fear. If he followed this thread, the tapestry took shape. There was money here, of course. There always is. Sir Basil's money, Fortescue's money, Lady Honoria's money that wanted to be both chaste and omnipotent. But money was noisy. In this business, the quiet motives were those of mastery and belonging. Someone had made a pattern out of the habits of others. Someone had designed the death not merely to punish or inherit, but to arrange the scene. It was a work of staging. Sir Basil, Fox ventured, very neutrally, wants too much to keep his grandeur intact, Alleyn said. He is the kind of man who would rage if the curtain were a 1/4 inch short of the floor. But his rage is theatrical. He has no privacy in it. Fortescue? Fortescue is a fanatic. He would kill a man for a wrong note. He would not be able to remove the body without making a speech about it. Lady Honoria? knows more about amateur theatricals than is healthy. She sees herself in other people's successes. She would have the nerve. She also has taste, which could be a brake or a spur, and she is not rich enough to be careless. Young Mr. Arbery is a romantic. If he were to do such a thing, he would throw it like a bouquet, and he is too frightened of audiences. Alleyn smiled faintly at the ghost light. No, there's an intelligence here that doesn't want applause. There is a hunger, yes, and there is fear, I think a great deal of fear, of being put away, tidied out, made expendable. Fox uncoupled his hands and blew out a breath that stirred the dust in a tiny fountain. The servants, he said. Yes. Alleyn let the word lie between them. The servants, the dressers, the stage, manager, the valet and the call boy, the women who made impalpable adjustments and believed themselves invisible. He had seen it before. The people who keep other people exact, who are required by nature and nurture to efface their own edges. There is sometimes a rebellion in perfection, and there is also love of a sort that prefers to manage its object. They are the custodians of the rituals. They know where the lids bend. He rose and, doing so, realized that his body had been chilled by sitting too long away from the life of the building. The ghost light burned with a little tremor. A draught had got into it. He imagined Miss Pym fussing softly, shielding the lamp with her hand, as one shields a candle in a church one is not sure one believes in. He imagined Lockett polishing something that was only clean because he could not bear an object to be finished by another's hand. "Shall we go home?" "Sir," Fox asked. "In a moment. There's a thing I want to try." He walked down the aisle and climbed, with that long-legged ease of his, to the stage. The boards spoke under his shoes. He went to the prompt desk and laid his hand flat upon it as he had seen Julian Arbery do, touched the little half-moon gouge where years of pencil had bitten into the wood. Then he crossed to the little table where the camellia had been set and opened the drawer that Miss Martin had opened by feel. He closed it again delicately. He picked up the silver pastille tin from the props tray where Fox, earlier, had placed it and weighed it in his palm. He clicked the lid once and then twice, softly. The sound was minute, but in the empty house it multiplied itself. Fox had come up and stood behind him. "Sir, there is an economy of motion in those who are perpetually supposed to be in the way." Alleyn said, "It's almost music. If I ask them all to run through their 5 minutes again, their mouths will lie and their hands will talk. We will give them a call, Brer Fox. Tomorrow, a proper call. Lady Honoria likes a rehearsal as much as she likes an opening. She will agree. We will watch how everyone keeps faith with their own devices. You won't name anyone?" "No." He shook his head. The theater was a great, quiet ear. We will merely arrange what they are already arranging for us, and if I am wrong, we will have wasted an hour in a place that is never dull. They went out by the stage door, where the draught came through the iron grill with an old London smell of damp brick and rain. A newspaper lay flattened on the pavement like a tired bird. Fox picked it up automatically and carried it to the bin. Alleyn paused, looking back through the green-lit corridor at the small, definitive square of the ghost light, and felt, as he had felt before, that the trivial held its own with the terrible and sometimes did more work. He did not think of justice. He thought of hands and their habits, and of the exact moment when a person decides that another person's routine is available for use. "Tomorrow, Fox," he said, "we will see what the dust has to say." The theater in daylight had an air of embarrassed intimacy. Without the crowding of evening, the gilt and crimson contrived to look more like an elderly lady's parlor, furbished for callers who had not, after all, announced themselves. Dust lay in the velvet as a softening veil. On the stage, a single rehearsal lamp cast a puddle of amber in which a piano seemed to drowse with its lid half lowered. Someone had left a white glove on the keyboard, and the instrument wore it with a faint air of satire. Alleyn, standing below in the stalls, allowed the quiet to settle about him, as if it were part of his wardrobe. He had sent Fox to tidy certain odds and ends with the stage doorman. The theatre manager had been appeased. Lady Daring had retired to her box with the patience of a woman accustomed to the formalities of death and the unalterable choreography of policemen. The principals were dispersed on little errands which they understood to be necessary. Mr. Calder had been seen to the office to write out a clear copy of a statement. Miss Vane had been persuaded to swallow tea and look more human than tragic. Sir Guy Hartwell, with the useful competence of men whose machines do not stutter in the rain, had explained to his daughter that she would not be made to say anything she didn't wish to say, and had been, on the whole, believed. Mr. Perrott, the stage manager, was complicatedly employed in doing nothing at all in a way that suggested indispensable activity. From this arrangement, Alleyn detached one person. She came to him along the aisle between the stalls with her usual self-effacement, which, like the dust on the velvet, softened without dulling. Miss Lydia Gray, who wrote letters, kept Sir Felix's appointments, ran a pen through his rough copies, and, in the slack water of rehearsal afternoons, made herself so quietly useful that one wondered how long one had been taking her for granted. Her clothes were the sort that do not wrinkle. A faint, inexpensive scent lingered near her and was so circumspect as to be almost a virtue. "You asked to see me alone, Inspector," she said, and in her hands, for all the world like a talisman, she carried a thin sheaf of music paper. He stepped into the amber pool and indicated one of the stalls. "If you don't mind the dust," he said, "and if you can forgive the indecency of discussing so private a matter in a public room, will you sit down?" She sat, not quite at ease, and laid the music on her lap, one finger resting along its edge with an affection as unthinking as habit. "You have been very helpful," Alleyn said. "I'm going to ask you to continue. There are, as you know, certain repetitions in this business that are the only means we have of coaxing the truth to show itself. When we pursue the same line twice or 3 times, we don't, I assure you, do it out of disrespect. I am not easily offended," Miss Gray said, "and perhaps repetition is our common trade." He glanced at the thin sheaf. "Those are yours?" She looked down. "Copies? For Mr. Calder?" "Not Sir Felix's hand." "No," she said. "His was bold. I'm timid even, on paper." "You are seldom timid, I think, with the work itself," Alleyn said. "No, don't answer. I've only been listening to phrases and to people." He gave a very small smile. "We'll keep to housekeeping." Yesterday evening, after the interval in rehearsal, Sir Felix went to his room. "Tell me again who took in the barley water." "I believe Mrs. Tuck made it. I was on the stage and then—" She paused. It was not a dramatic pause, but one made by a person who habitually chooses exact words. "And then Mr. Perrott called me. Sir Felix rang for me." Alleyn nodded. "At 9:20, you were at prompt side. Mr. Perrott had you in sight for most of the evening." "Yes. Mrs. Tuck thinks she took the tray in at about 10 past. The stage doorkeeper had a visitor sign the book at 1:15. Mr. Royce, the portrait painter, after you left, which we can put aside. Between Mrs. Tuck and yourself, the barley water was left on the little table." "Yes. There is a small discrepancy," Alleyn said, with the gentle irrelevance that is harder to oppose than logic. "In the matter of the lemon. I'm told Sir Felix was fastidious to the point of childhood about the slice of lemon. Always, Mrs. Tuck says. It is not an easily forgettable ritual, but there was no lemon in the glass. There is no lemon now in the theatre, save in a bowl in Lady Daring's private room, and that bowl is presently full." Miss Gray's finger moved fractionally on the music. "I should hardly make much of lemons." "No?" Alleyn's voice was mild. "Forgive me. There may be nothing in it, but in a case where so much is made of little things, we cannot be too respectful." Another small item, Sir Felix's own glass, engraved with a little crown and the letter F, is normally kept in his drawer and used always by him, even here. We found it washed, but not—" He paused. "Not used." She said nothing. And a third, Alleyn continued with the same conversational persistence. The forged note to Mr. Calder. It was a strained attempt, perhaps, but we will call it forged. Someone used Sir Felix's paper. Not his hand, however. The flourish in the L and the tidying of the tails. No. There is an economy in your hand that has no patience with flourishes, Miss Grey. You dot your I's as if you were putting a neat point at the end of a sentence. But when you copy music, he touched her pages lightly. You are almost prodigal. It is affectionate, prodigality. And I think you have told me once that Sir Felix liked his fair copies to look as if they had been written in a good temper. He hated blots, Miss Grey said, and there was a flicker. He could not have said where it lived, in her voice perhaps, no more than one notes a small draught on an otherwise closed afternoon. Of course he did, Alleyn said. He hated any admission that work might be labored. He left this in the air and moved a little, as if to see her at a different angle. Above them, in the box, Lady Daring's pale head turned faintly, and then was still. It was like a faded cameo on velvet. We have had our second stir in the water, he said quietly. Miss Vane's indisposition last night after taking a lozenge from the same jar Sir Felix used. It has mattered, I think, that she was not very ill. And it has made me believe that the hand that did this was not inclined to operate in a butcher's shop. So we are left with someone who understands a man's routine, his indulgences and his terrors, and is injured enough to hurt, but not so brutal as to fling blood about. And that, he added, with a small movement of his hand, narrows the company. She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were clear and very plain. You wish me to be frank? Only if it does not cost you too much, he said, and could have mocked himself for the folly of the sentence, had he not known that there are only two ways to approach certain people, and brutal kindness is not one of them. He used me, she said. She did not dramatize it. The words lay between them as soberly as the glove on the piano keys. He used me because I could be useful, and because it suited him to believe the use was acknowledged. He took melodies from things I had written in exercise and made his themes from them. He called it collaboration. He sent me to tell people he could not bring himself to face. He was not, Inspector, a good man. So much you know. Sir Felix's talent, if we must give it its full name, did not make him good. And you? Alleyn asked. Were you good? She smiled a little. The look was quick and purely human. No. I was perhaps better than he made me, but not so very much. He let the smile lie undisturbed and said, Mr. Calder tells me you left the stage on Mr. Perrott's call some minutes before Sir Felix rang. The stage door book persuades me that you could not have entered the green room by the passage without being seen by Mr. Pilcher when he returned with Mr. Royce. We have discovered, however, from a housemaid, that the little fire door beyond Prompt Corner is, despite what anyone would say, often used. It opens into a corridor that gives upon Sir Felix's door by the farther turn. It sticks. One must put a shoulder to it. You have a fine shoulder, Miss Grey. I have seen you lift a pile of volumes that would as soon be lifted by a man. You have remarkably observant eyes, she said. Yes, the door sticks. And one more smallness, Alleyn went on. It is entirely improper of me to introduce music into police work, but there it is. The little turn of the oboe in the fourth bar of the second subject of the new overture. Did you call it a smile? Someone did last night when it was being played. It is not Sir Felix's smile. He was too ceremonious. It is yours. Miss Grey's hands upon the paper were quite still. There is a... She stopped and then began again as if she had forgotten he was there, and the habit of thinking aloud had recaptured her. There is a moment when one knows what one has made, and the person to whom one has given it calls it his, when one is silly enough to mind. Afterwards, perhaps, one makes a note that one is ridiculous and learns not to mind. But the first time, one minds. Alleyn said, How long had you intended to leave him? Her head turned a fraction. "You think that was my intention?" "Mr. Royce hinted that you had refused to sit to him again because you were going to be too busy. Miss Vane, in a temper, said last night that you would not bend over a desk much longer. And you wrote a letter to Mr. Calder, which I haven't yet shown you, and shan't until tomorrow, in which you speak about the management of one's small freedoms. That excellent phrase is not Sir Felix's. How diligent you are." "I have to be," he said simply, "when the person I'm trying to understand is far cleverer than I am." Something in her face altered, very slightly. He saw an expression that would have been tenderness if it had not been, in the very next breath, something else. "You are much less stupid than you pretend," she said. "What do you want me to do?" He looked at the glove on the keyboard and at the empty tiers. A cleaner moved, very far away, like a moth. "I should like you, when I ask you to come this evening to Lady Daring's box, to come," he said. "I should like you, when I speak about the sequence of last night, to listen. Above all, I should like you not to force my hand." "You intend to make a scene," she said gently, and there was something curious. Not fear, not disdain, but a kind of weary pity. "No. I intend to ask a few people to stand still for a moment while I tell them how people behave when they are hurt." His mouth crooked. "There will be no shouting. Lady Daring would not tolerate it." Miss Grey's hands folded the music together as if she were putting away a garment. "You will be kind," she said. It was not a plea. It was the sort of statement one makes when one has weighed all the possible passions against the weight of a civilized request, and found, oddly, that the latter is heavier. "I shall be as kind as the thing allows," said Alleyn. She rose. The light, lifting its level as if in response, showed the fine bones of her face and the carefulness of her mouth. "I'm tired," she said. "I shall rest now. Mr. Perrott will know where I am." "Mr. Perrott always knows," Alleyn said. When she had gone, he stood for a little with his hand on the back of the stall chair. The sense, which he never entirely escaped in certain cases, of a music faintly audible and just beyond the compass of ordinary hearing, made itself felt again. His own world had never been much concerned with overtures, but it had had its preludes, and he recognized the moment when all that could be done without cruelty had been done. Fox returned up the aisle with his steady tread and an envelope in his hand. "Sir," he said in his quiet way, "the chemist's preliminary. Lemon peel with an alkaloid, your barley water, and Pilcher's found the missing key." "Has he?" said Alleyn. "Good man, Pilcher." Fox looked at the empty stage and then at Alleyn. "This evening?" "Yes," Alleyn said. "In the box. We won't make a play of it, Brer Fox. We'll let the thing explain itself. It will do so better than we can." He sent Fox away and stood for a moment longer, letting the cool of the great room touch him. It would have been agreeable to step out into air and noise and be no more responsible for other people's miseries. But he had undertaken this, as he had undertaken others, and the business of keeping civility alive among the ruins of untidier emotions was not as contemptible as it sounded. He turned, then, to attend to Mrs. Tuck and her lemons, to Mr. Perrott and his doors, and to Lady Daring, who would require a chair placed at exactly the right angle to the stage, and a decanter that did not look like a fuss. They had drifted back, as if by the courtesy of habit, to the small music room where the overture had first found its feet. The candles in the sconces were again lit. A new impartial quiet rested on the instruments. The metronome, that stubborn little sovereign, stood still. Lady Honora chose a chair by the hearth and folded her hands upon the knob of her stick. Lydia Carvel sat a little away from the others and gazed at the closed lid of the piano with an actress's distant attention. Camilla Lascelles hovered by the harpsichord, like a very modern and rather frightened cherub. Sir Felix Tregarin, immaculate, upright, and faintly amused, took up a position near the mantelpiece. The butler, Winship had crept in with the noiselessness of a necessary presence and retired to a modest distance. Miss Temple, the secretary, thin and proper, kept near the door, as if some discipline exacted by typewriters and retyped letters prevented her from entirely entering a room when there was nothing to take down. Dr. Peregrine North's scholarly head bent over a chair back, and from the threshold, Fox waited, a large and patient shade. Alleyn did not stand to take command of the room. He was seated on the arm of a low chair with his long fingers interlaced and his eyes, friendly and reflective, on the empty tray that had once held glasses and the conservative jug of barley water. He had asked for that particular tray to be brought in, and it had been set upon a side table. The jug's chaste line was a little dulled by the rim of lemon oils, now dried to pallor. "I've kept you," he said, from the small and understandable relief of going to bed. "I'm sorry. It will be a little longer. Afterwards, I hope you will sleep." Lady Honoria said, "If it is to be said, say it, Mr. Alleyn. We are none of us, I think, unprepared." Sir Felix made a slight movement with his shoulders. "One is always prepared for a line. The trick is to know when to deliver it." Alleyn smiled. "Yes, and the first line is, perhaps already before us, on the tray. Mr. Winship, I'll begin with you, if I may." The butler stepped forward and stood by the table as if it were an altar. "You told me," Alleyn said, "that Mr. Martin was the only person who regularly asked for lemon with his barley water." "That is so, sir. Mr. Martin said it improved the taste. I always set the lemon dish alongside." "And the carafes were arranged in a particular order?" "Yes, sir. Mr. Martin's glass placed nearest the harpsichord. That is to say, he would not have wished to reach across either Miss Lascelles or Miss Carvel." "The arrangement varied tonight," Alleyn said. Winship's eyelids flickered. "I did not at first think it of consequence, sir." "No, one rarely does think it of consequence, and yet it sometimes is. When you brought the tray in after the interval, Mr. Winship, you found someone already here." Winship glanced, almost invisibly, towards the fireplace. "Sir Felix had remained, sir, to take a call from Mr. Pottle. The telephone is on the writing table in the corner. Sir Felix said Mr. Pottle had got a review to write and was pestering for particulars. Sir Felix was the only one Mr. Pottle would venture to pester." Sir Felix looked pleasantly into the room. "We must forgive Swithin his enthusiasm for the printed word." "The telephone was used," Alleyn agreed. "We shall have the exchange confirm it. Mr. Winship, when you set down the tray, did you go out again?" "I did, sir. Mrs. Briggs was in a state about the cold souffle. I was gone a very few minutes." "And when you returned, Mr. Martin's glass had been moved from the near end to the far end?" "It had, sir. I observed it, but did not see by whom." "No, sir." "Thank you." Sir Felix, who had listened with a kind of courteous detachment, took out his handkerchief and with admirable unself-consciousness touched his upper lip. His cuff, Alleyn noticed, shone faintly. Lemon oils leave a shine that is unlike any other. Miss Temple spoke suddenly. "Am I to understand," she asked in her flat, disapproving voice, "that some miscreant tampered with Mr. Martin's drink? It seems quite theatrical." "There is no harm," Alleyn said. "In theatre, Miss Temple. It is only unfortunate when theatre is employed in murder." "Then it was poison?" Camilla whispered. I felt that smell, that faint almond." "Did you?" Sir Felix said too quickly. "I can assure you, my dear child, that one smells almonds only in penny dreadfuls." "Sometimes in hospitals," said Dr. North gently. "I remember—" "Not now, Peregrine," murmured Lydia without looking up. Alleyn's voice remained unhurried. "It was a very small dose," he said. "Too large to be mistaken for a tonic, too small to provide alarm before it accomplished its purpose. The taste was masked with lemon, and the odor dissipated with the steam of the room and the more insistent fragrances of scent and flowers." Mr. Martin did not cry out. He did not even greatly move. He made a small sound, almost as if he completed a cadence. And then he was still. They were all very quiet. "It is odd," Alleyn said, "how much we rely in these rooms on ritual. One person leaves his gloves always by the metronome, another keeps to the left-hand end of the sofa. A third will never drink from a glass that has not been rinsed at the sink in the green room. Mr. Martin had his lemon and his glass in his place, and then he had not. Someone made a small alteration, dressed it as a kindness, and left it at that. And someone in this room wrote Mr. Martin a note." Miss Temple coloured. "If you mean the typed slip that Mr. Martin received during the interval, yes. I typed it. Sir Felix dictated. Mr. Martin was wanted by Mr. Pottle, who had telephoned, and I thought no harm." "Of course you did," Alleyn said. "You were the secretary. You typed as you were told." Sir Felix lifted his eyebrows. "Do allow me. I have not denied sending for Martin. Swithin had telephoned. Hugo had promised Swithin some phrase that he intended for the program note. I was irritated with interruptions and told Temple to fetch him. It led to haste, that is all." Alleyn nodded. "It led, oddly enough, to an absence," he said. "Mr. Martin did not come to the telephone." No one spoke. He went instead to the pantry. He went there because someone told him, by a small postscript scribbled at the foot of the typed message, that Winship had managed to procure fresh lemons from Lord's grocer. He read the type, and then the ink. Miss Temple did not add the postscript. She is unadventurous in her hand, but the G she forms has a closed loop. The one in the word grocer was open. Nor did Lady Honoria write it, nor Miss Lascelles, nor Dr. North. I asked you each, earlier, to write out a line for me. The open G belongs with a burr on the tail to Sir Felix." There was a small stir, like the first movement of a sleeping bird. Sir Felix laughed, not unkindly. "My dear Inspector, we are to be undone by a tail on a G." Alleyn's own smile was brief. "By that, and by your cuff. By a smudge on your sleeve from the oils of a lemon, expressed not by thumb and forefinger as one would do to scent a glass, but by pressing hard, from the outside, into something soft. There are 2 punctures in the lemon rind we have kept. Very delicate, very neat. You used a small syringe. It is not one of the medical ones Mr. Fox has enumerated from the house. None of those has so fine a needle. But there is a prop case in your wardrobe from the physician of Prague, Mauper's, and it contains a theatrical hypodermic that you would know how to employ. You have used it on stage with admirable effect. It would serve now. One presses the rind. One introduces a little fluid. The lemon graciously does the rest." "Fluid," Lydia said, and now she had lifted her face and the loveliness of it had sharpened. "Felix, what did you do?" Sir Felix looked very briefly at her, and then at Alleyn. He seemed suddenly to grow older, as if the rich husk of him had cracked. "I'm a coward," he said almost conversationally. "It is a surprise to me." Lady Honoria's hand tightened on the stick. "Sir," he did not look at her, "you must set the scene properly, Inspector, if we are to go through it." It was not jealousy. Jealousy, in my experience, is a boring line, overwritten and always taken too high. It was fear. Hugo had gone to see North yesterday afternoon. He had discovered, by some shabby arithmetic of contracts and receipts that only a composer would take the trouble to learn, that the charity subscription had been improperly handled. Not by Lady Honoria, not by North, by me. Lydia made a small sound. Camilla's hands flew to her mouth. Miss Temple uttered, involuntarily, "Oh." "In fact," Sir Felix went on, the words flowing now in a voice that had sold many confessions to many audiences, "there was no stealing to speak of. I borrowed. One borrows to make a mark. It was to secure the orchestra. They ask for money like barrow boys. One intends to replace the loan, and then one does not. Hugo told me this morning he would inform the committee if I did not cancel the performance. He said I had one day, a melodramatic ultimatum. He also told me he would remove his overture. I could not bear, more than I have not been able to bear for some time, to be left a figure without music. You were also afraid, Alleyn said, that Miss Carvel would go with him. Sir Felix shut his eyes. I beg you not, he said softly, to make me ridiculous. Lydia rose and crossed the few feet between them with the measured step of one who has long rehearsed love and shock and forgiveness. She did not touch him. She stood very near and looked at him as if past him, at the part of him that had been contained by the face. Felix, she said, we are all ridiculous, you and I. It is the one element we never admitted. Oh, poor us. He opened his eyes and smiled at her. My dear, he said, my dear. Alleyn did a small, unobtrusive thing. He lifted his hand and let it fall back upon the chair arm, and in that trivial cadence there was an ending. You understood, he said, that there would be a smell. You moved Mr. Martin's glass and set his own at a remove, so that a young person, Miss Lascelles, might, doing some kindness of her own, bring it to him. You wrote and you contrived, and then you waited here and spoke to Mr. Pottle of tempo and program notes while a man went to a pantry, expressed assent, and came back to die in a chair by a metronome. Sir Felix said, I am very tired. Lady Honoria's mouth trembled. What is there? She whispered to Alleyn. There is what there always is, Alleyn said very gently. A few formalities, Mr. Fox. Fox took a step into the room. He had the virtue of being as unobtrusive as a large man could be. Sir Felix looked from one to the other of them, smiled, and began to draw on his gloves. He did it with the same composed attention with which he had once taken a curtain call. When he had finished, he held out his hands. The gesture had both surrender and courtesy in it, like an old beau to an old adversary. Lydia said quickly, May I? Alleyn inclined his head to her. Yes, he said. Please. She came close and kissed Sir Felix's cheek. He closed his eyes, but did not otherwise move. Come, Fox said, as if inviting him to a chair in a gentleman's club. They went without noise. There was a little silence. The sort of silence that follows the end of a piece when no one wishes to be the first to applaud. Winship, with a motion of great dignity, went to the tray, and with the same deference with which he would have removed a finished course, took it up and carried it out. Lady Honoria said, after a moment, Mr. Alleyn, I shall want, tomorrow, to know what I am to tell the committee. Tell them, Alleyn said, that the performance will not take place, and that the subscriptions will be made good. Dr. North said, Between us, Honoria, we can arrange it. It is not beyond arithmetic. Miss Temple drew a small breath, as if released from a long-held pose. Camilla wept, quite silently, looking away, her tears fallen on the harpsichord lid like small beads of glass. Alleyn stood. It's late, he said, and his voice was quiet again, the official cadence folded away. You will do better to sleep. He went to the door. In the passage, he met Fox returning, and for a moment they spoke together, like two men remarking upon the weather after the season's last performance. Then he went out into the hall where the scattered programs and gloves lay like little casualties of another evening, and stood for a while, looking up at the faintly gilt ceiling. The house had settled back into itself. Somewhere, far distant, a clock prepared itself to strike. The metronome on the piano, left alone, reflected a point of candlelight in its black, motionless face. They let the announcement go out to the foyer, an interval extension on account of a trifling backstage inconvenience, and the audience, in their winter coats and diamonds, smiled at one another, or consulted their programs, or decided that a glass of sherry would accommodate inconvenience very well. The orchestra had gone mute, players hunched over their instruments, murmuring. Alleyn stood at the threshold of the green room and looked in at the woman who had been told gently and had not wept. Miss Vane had rearranged her gloves until they lay side by side on the arm of the damask chair, fingers aligned like sleeping twins. The extraordinary whiteness of her profile, the faint bluish tracery at her temples, the precise bow of her mouth, all the apparatus of beauty remained obedient. It was, Alleyn thought, beauty in the service of an older profession than song, the control of appearance. Fox, with a tactfulness learned over long years, had drifted to the door and waited there like a discreet piece of furniture. "We shall have to go presently," Alleyn said. "The car is at the stage door. There will be the preliminary formalities. I expect your solicitor will meet you there." "I have written the name," she said, and touched her clutch on the table. "You have been very considerate, Mr. Inspector. I should like to speak to Dame Sybil before we go. Is that allowed?" "Yes," said Alleyn. "Briefly." She inclined her head. "Briefly," she agreed as one who had made a number of pacts with time. Her gaze then shifted past Alleyn's shoulder to the high mirror framed in gilt, and beyond it to the dim corridor with its frayed green baize and fading posters. The last season's triumphs now bleached to the same beige irrelevance. Her eyes rested again on her gloves, as if they were the single points capable of bearing her attention. Dame Sybil came in on a whisper of silk and expensive fur. She had the admirable English gift of being unshatterable in public, and the almost equally admirable English preference for collapsing, if at all inside a wardrobe with the door shut. She touched Miss Vane's shoulder with unpracticed affection. "My dear," she said, and then, "I shall see that the understudy goes on. The program will not suffer. You understand." Miss Vane's smile was mechanical then, with an effort, less so. Very sensible. It was never a role for me after all, not in the end. Alleyn looked aside. He took in the spiky, blotched hand of the stage manager on the jamb, its habitual smear of graphite, and beyond, the butler. No, not a butler here, not in the theatre world, but Mr. Lansing, who had the butler's caution and none of his dignity. He stood at parade attention with his clipboard, eyes carefully evacuated of curiosity. "There will be talk," Dame Sybil said to Alleyn, not asking him to stop it because she knew he could. Not. "There is always talk when art and crime are ungracious enough to share a building. We are as much an asylum for gossip as for genius." "Better talk than the sort of silence we have endured," Miss Vane said, almost inaudibly. "Better for everyone." Alleyn met her eyes and saw, or fancied he saw, the tiny flare of bitterness that had burned all evening behind that immaculate pallor. He had thought, earlier, in the little ante-room, as she listened to him place piece after impossible piece upon the table of her vanity, her visit to Sir Julian's room under the colour of consultation, the substitution of the atomizer, identical down to its mother-of-pearl cap and engraved band, the forged memorandum in Miss Costa's impeccable hand that had delivered the man to his death at the hour which best disguised her own absence, that she would break the surface and scream at last. But she had not. She had said, "Very well, then," as if consenting to an alteration in the music. There had been other people who might, and in another configuration perhaps would, have done it. The young composer with his too bright certainty and his bundle of manuscript tied as jealously as a miser's purse. Miss Cost, whose orderliness was almost an anger, and who hid, under her decorum, loyalties that pointed in dangerous directions. Mr. Lansing, ruled by the clock to a degree that made any irregularity an outrage. The critic with the smile of a cat that has swallowed an abolished canary. They would, Alleyn thought, all be required to live with their failed possibilities. That was its own sort of justice, and sometimes the only sort there was. Fox coughed the quiet signal. "Car's ready, sir, and the other arrangements are made." He meant the constable at the stage door, the short hallway spared for them, the request to the press to behave. Half a prayer, that. "Will you take my wrap, Dame Sybil?" Miss Vane asked, rising. "It's rather heavy for the car." I shouldn't like to crease it. Someone else may want it later." She placed it in Dame Sybil's keeping with the odd formality of a gift, as if she had detached a piece of herself. Dame Sybil hesitated, then accepted. Her face had stiffened that fraction which indicates the admission of the personal in public. "Miss Vane," Alleyn said. She looked not at him, but at her own reflection, and at the reflection's careful composure. "Inspector." She returned and walked out between them, light, precise, as if measuring her steps against an invisible bar. They took the passage along which earlier a pair of small boys in sailor suits had tumbled, rehearsing their chorus, their laughter, and not knowing that somewhere else in the building a man sat as if asleep and would never again raise a hand. The smell was of powder and rope and damp velvet. The corridor's length was a kind of narrowing of options. Fox, with his great bulk contained in patience, walked a pace behind. At the stage door, a last trifling obstruction, a young violinist with a haunted expression and a rigidly held case, who had, apparently, not learned that doors open to some and moderate themselves to others. He saw Miss Vane, and his mouth half opened on her name, but he said nothing. She inclined her head as if acknowledging shareholding in a ship bound for cold water, and passed into the night. The car paused as if to permit a reprieve. There was no reprieve. Miss Vane got in and folded her hands. She watched the stage door as it moved from her, diminishing until the corner took it. In the front seat, Fox's profile was an obdurate cliff. Alleyn sat beside him, content, as was his way, to let the rhythm of tires and the small chattering of the city compose a calm for thought. "Pity," Fox said after a bit. Very low. "Yes," said Alleyn. "It is." "She didn't mean it as a habit, I dare say," Fox ventured, groping for the moral terms of it as a man gropes for a match in the dark. "No," said Alleyn. "Once only. That is what she told herself, the sort of once that lays an egg and becomes always." Fox drove on. They came to the police yard and its wet cobbles, shining like the cases of very old beetles under the lamps. The constable at the gate touched his cap. The routine, that blessed tyrant, took possession of their movements. It had, in such hours, a priestly aspect. In the small room where the first formalities take place and the pen requires signatures from hands that have remembered more important gestures, Miss Vane listened with a strange attentiveness, as if the wording of the charge were a cadenza set at a pitch no one else could hear. "You understand you will be allowed to communicate with your solicitor," Alleyn said, and recited the rest, and watched the flicker of comprehension pass through her like a ripple through glass. "I should like to write 2 notes," she said when he had finished. "One to Dame Sybil, and one to—" Something, not grief but its stark blue print, flitted over her face. "To Mr. Field. He will need his music back. He entrusted it to me. I kept it longer than I ought." Alleyn hesitated and then said, "Very well." He took paper from the drawer and set the blotter straight. She wrote without visible dependence on thought, blotting each sheet with a fastidiousness that did not belong to this place. When she had finished, she looked at him with a sudden curiosity. "How did you know," she asked, almost conversational, "that it was not Miss Cost, for instance, or that child playing a genius?" "Ritual," said Alleyn. Sir Julian's rituals were the small tyrannies of a man who had given himself large freedoms. He liked to be certain of precisely how the little things went, so that the big things could be left to talent. You knew them as well as he did. The atomizer, for example. He was a creature of brand labeling. He would not have suffered the substitute perfume bottle you had made. "I had it made to match," she said. "I thought so." "It matched for the audience," Alleyn told her. "Not for him. But he did not notice. He was not expecting to find you in that role. That was the greater betrayal, perhaps. He had written you a part, and you elected another." She looked down at her hands. "Yes," she said with absolute simplicity. I could go on being anyone he chose if he allowed me to sing, but he would not allow me to be anyone at all. There is a point, Inspector, at which a woman's voice becomes not a string, but a rope. It was very quiet. I had hoped. It doesn't matter, he said softly. No. She rose when the time dictated it. Fox's shadow filled the doorway. In the corridor, someone cleared a throat, the sound echoing with faint indecency against the whitewash. Miss Vane passed out with no more stiffness than she had worn all evening. She had not once looked back. When Alleyn returned to the theatre an hour later, because there were statements to collect and a stage manager to calm and a patroness to reassure that the doors of respectability had not blown off their hinges, he found the overture proceeding. The understudy had an intelligent, frightened face and sang on the breath, willing beauty into existence by obedience. The orchestra, dutiful and a little savage with its own emotion, played as if it were a pact. Mr. Lansing stepped out of the prompt corner and, gathering himself, reported. "All cues observed, sir. Miss Carberry is holding up splendidly, and the flowers were removed from the rostrum as requested." "Flowers?" Alleyn asked. "The lilies, for the maestro. Someone put them there. It seemed—" His mouth tightened and he left the sentence neat and finished, like an end knot. "We thought it better to have them in the side passage." Alleyn nodded and crossed to where, in that side passage, the lilies stood, extravagant white mouths open to scent that now seemed indecently alive. A thin ribbon of black crepe had been tied about them and hastily removed. He imagined the hand that had tied it, meaning tribute, and the other hand that had removed it, meaning prudence. Between them stretched the problem of the world. He stood for a moment with the cool of the stone wall against his shoulder and the music laying down its certain assertions like lines on an etching. Fox arrived, wiping his shoes with an apologetic handkerchief. "All tidy at our end," he said. "She's very quiet. It'll all go along without fuss." "As it must," Alleyn said. "We'll finish here." In the wings, Dame Sybil, corseted by pride, watched from her corner. She looked at Alleyn as if to ask if the theatre lived still. He inclined his head gravely. The overture moved to its close, and it was almost, for the space of a breath, possible to pretend that the treachery had belonged to the title only, and not to the people gathering their lines and their breaths around it. Then the thought passed, and duty reclaimed them, and he went on into the small fuss of ordinary things which, taken together, make what we call justice. The theatre had a way of looking abashed in full daylight. Without the forgiving dusk of lamps and footlights, it showed its pulleys and fly ropes with an almost indecent candor. A great, draughty shell of workmanship and rehearsal marks, chalked reminders on blackened floors, chips in the gilt that at night pretended to be grandeur. Alleyn, who was fond of the theatre and suspicious of its anxieties, found himself alone on the stage while Fox concluded some mournful chore with the local inspector. Someone had drawn the house curtains back and left them parted. Through that worn velvet aperture, the ranks of empty seats regarded him like composed and numerous acquaintances who had agreed to say nothing. A small covey of dust motes launched themselves when he brushed his sleeve. A metronome sat on the prompt table, its wand angled in arrested motion. He felt the impulse, half whimsical and wholly unprofessional, to set it ticking. He did not. It had ticked at the beginning of this business in another room and in the mind of another person. It should not tick for him. Below, in the pit, the stands were bare. A score lay open on the conductor's desk, a pencil between the pages like a narrow bridge poised over a silence. He saw, even from the stage, that the pencil's chewing scars matched a small crescent-frayed tooth in the paper's margin. Such tiny congruences, he thought, had more to do with human behavior than with jurisprudence. He heard Fox's footfall before he saw the man. Fox had a way of moving that was respectful of other silences. He came to the foot of the steps and stood looking up at Alleyn, his vast face grave and rather endearing. "All signed off, sir," he said. He's in the van. They're very quiet, these here theatrical folk. They rehearse silence as if it had cues, said Alleyn. How is she? Composed. Fox's mouth did not express any judgment. Asked me if she might fetch a shawl from her room. The maid is with her. I said we should send for it. She said she would prefer to go herself, did not insist. Alleyn nodded. She will be better with the maid and the housekeeper, he said. There is something to attend to in the green room. Burn it, Fox. Tell Mr. Blunt to bring a fire bucket. Quietly. Fox's eyes accepted this without curiosity. There's a lot to be said for quiet, he observed. I'll see to it. When Fox had gone, Alleyn stood a little while longer and thought, not so much of the person in the van as of those who remained. The stage manager would straighten his lists. The carpenter would look to the trap that had misbehaved at the matinee 2 weeks ago. The dresser would sort garments by their furtive hierarchies. Gowns that were stroked, gowns that were shrugged on, gowns that swallowed the women. And the butler, call him a butler because in such establishments there was always one, though they named him anything but, would have begun already to reproduce the day as it should have been if the day had not been used for murder. He found that he did not want to see the green room again. He had seen it at its worst, and its worst, last night, had not been dramatic. Someone had sat down and breathed and would never breathe again. The room's taste for affectation, photographs in slanted frames, a glass of flowers that had chosen their own deaths, had been rebuked by that quietness. The routine of compliments would have played itself later and been forgotten. Now there was no necessity to recall the more obvious details, the little scorch on the satin cover of the chaise, the imprint of a cup on the lacquered table that had been moved afterwards and then moved back imperfectly, the letter with its wrong edge torn, the faintest stickiness beneath the varnish of the bell push. He thought of fingers, habitual and unsuspecting, following accustomed itineraries. Ritual had been the instrument, and then the betrayal. He had almost admired the neatness of the thought that had deflected the instrument. A movement under the dress circle drew his attention. It was the secretary, the devoted man with the anxious stoop, collecting programs from last night and piling them in a box. He did it with the patient piety of someone who would find safety if he could only restore order. Alleyn watched him for a moment, and then looked away. When one has explained one's theory and it has proved to be the truth, there is very little to be gained by confronting people with the practicalities of it. They will manage those unhelped. He went down into the pit and stood on the conductor's rostrum. The score was where he had seen it, the pencil like a stay against collapse. On the topmost right-hand corner of the page, a hand had written a bar number that did not belong. The hand had wanted to be authoritative and had betrayed its origin. There were other betrayals. He closed the book and replaced the pencil precisely where it had been. He was not sentimental about these things, but there are occasions when respect, like good manners, is owed to inanimate tools because of the human intention that informs them. Fox returned by the side aisle. "Hugh's done that," he said neutrally. "There'll be nothing in the grate to trouble anybody." "Thank you, Brer Fox," said Alleyn. "We'll leave them the room to tidy and make a poor job of. That will suit them." Fox made a small chuff of amusement. "They're a tribe," he said, as if admitting to something long decided. "They'll talk about it with their faces and not with their voices. The younger ones will fancy they've had an experience. The older ones," he glanced quickly at Alleyn, "will wash the cups very carefully and throw away the dishcloth." "Yes," said Alleyn, after the pause such a remark requires. "We shall go back to town this afternoon. There's a report to write, and in the morning I think I shall be respectable and go to the office in a tie. You might telephone Troy and ask if she would like to dine in the sort of place that asks you what wine you shall have and then gives you what it has." Fox's eyes softened with their usual uncritical affection when Troy's name was spoken. "I'll do that, sir. She'll like you in a tie. There's a taxi for us when you're ready." In the corridor, the smell of sighs and paint asserted itself, wholesome and faintly melancholy. An old call board still carried the chalked name of the piece, as if it were a petition. "Overture," said Alleyn aloud, and then, because he seldom trusted his own tendency to quotation, stopped there. He had seen too many overtures to be convinced by their promises. The overture he had dealt with in this case had been composed of small preparations. A special cup put aside because the glaze had dulled in such a way as to go unseen at a particular angle. A door opened because it was habit, and a draught welcomed because it would either divert or assist. A letter laid where it could not fail to be found by the eyes that wanted to find exactly that. It had relied, as good overtures do, on the expectation that the rest would follow. And it had, not because the instruments were obedient, but because they were themselves. Character, Alleyn thought, does not play out of key for very long. He stepped into the green room because in the end he must. The housekeeper, solemn as an usher, stood aside for him. She had taken away the cup. The scorch on the satin remained, a small indecorous blot. It would be covered, he supposed, and later unpicked in idle conversation, and in a year forgotten, and then, perhaps, spoken of again by someone who had come new to the theatre and wanted a story. He looked at the place on the table where his evidence had been. There was a faint circle, only less visible now because his instruction had been carried out. He remembered the expression with which the guilty had heard him name it. It had not been relief or despair. Those are theatrical emotions, and people reserve them for audiences. It had been a sort of consenting weariness. He had seen it before. It seemed to Alleyn that it belonged to those who had been clever at last, and were pleased to be finished with it. When he came out to the stage again, the secretary had gone, and a young woman was practicing a bow to no one. She rose and dipped and rose, careful as a child. She saw him and started, then smiled in that small, embarrassed way of people who discover they have an audience and did not intend to. He lifted his hat. She would, he thought, be one of those who washed cups carefully. He hoped that would be her share and no more. At the stage door, the day was palely bright. A van stood, indifferent, and two policemen conversed. A boy with a bicycle leaned and inspected the world through the spokes as if it were merely a new sort of lattice. From within came the sound of someone moving a chair. It was a homely sound, and it pleased him. He walked with Fox to the waiting taxi. "It was a mean motive," said Fox in his flat voice, as if he had suddenly remembered that they were sometimes supposed to label these things. "Jealousy and vanity and money. Not much poetry in it." "Poetry," said Alleyn, getting in, "is chiefly in the arrangement." He looked out of the window at the blank door with its peeling paint, and in the rests. They drove away. The town folded up behind them and opened in front as towns do, with an appearance of having always been so. Fox began, in his careful way, to speak of a minor clerk who required a memorandum and of a constable whose wife had met with an accident involving a bread cart. Alleyn listened and replied when he must. He thought rather of Troy's hands and of the small noises her brushes made when she failed to consult him and was at her work. Later he would tell her, perhaps, that nothing had been dramatic. She would look at him with that quiet appraisal that took hold of both his comfort and his conscience and made something tolerable out of them. Just at the outskirts, when the hedges leaned close and the taxi's tires hissed on the damp road, he said, more to himself than to Fox, "They will go on. They always go on. One has the impression that the curtain has fallen, but it turns out someone has only pulled it to." Fox nodded as if this were about petrol. "We'll be in time for your tie," he said. He rubbed his large hands, not with satisfaction, but as if he reminded himself they were his to operate. "Funny that a thing can be done so small-like," he added, "and be so big afterwards." Alleyn looked out at a field waiting for spring, its clods somber and patient. "It was not small," he said gently. "It was intricate. That is worse." When they reached the railway station, he went unremarked through the ordinary demonstrations of travel. On the platform, a porter whistled 2 notes and then, remembering himself, stopped. The train drew up and people distributed themselves as if they had been counted. He sat and, when the countryside began to move, allowed his thoughts to settle like powdery dust in a sunbeam. For a long time he watched the hedgerows go by. Presently he imagined Troy in her studio with a cup of paint water mistaken for tea, and smiled, and then, because the day had been what it was, did not smile again until London gathered him, impersonal and vast, into its indifferent overture.